Hi, everyone. So welcome to the second day, the second plenary day of the G7 Global Strategy Meeting. Welcome to have you all. We still have people joining us as we go on, and we'll be meeting them. But just want to say, I hope you've enjoyed the first plenary day, and then the workshops have been taking place for the past week. In hindsight, for someone who's getting up at 8 o'clock for 8 o'clock calls every morning, it's been an ambitious agenda, but been really good discussions in the workshops. And I think it's been really fantastic that everyone's contributed and created such vibrant engagements. So just want to take your attention to the Jamboard. The link is in the chat, and I think Ope and Joe from Uniting to Combat NTDs are giving fantastic support to us today. And so open the Jamboard, because that's where we're going to be capturing our notes and the agenda and some information like that. Also, if you had never filled in the registration participants list, can you please put your name and bio just quickly into the chat box, and so people know who's online. So I just to say, I rejigged the agenda slightly for today. The reason I did that, one, is I think we were quite ambitious in terms of how much, it was a bit of a marathon, the first one, not only with one break. So I've just introduced a couple more breaks in, just little 10-minute sort of size. We can go and stretch our legs and readjust our eyes from staring at a screen. So we're just going to kick off with the working group reports very quickly. We're then going to go into the, we're going to have a 10-minute break, and then we're going to build the 2020 timeline. Again, we had some links in the chat, which will take us to a Google Doc, which I have started filling in, and we'll go over that. But we'll also use the Jamboard to look at a G7 specific timeline, and John Ruthroff is going to help us with that. We're then going to take a look at the overview of 2021 advocacy campaigning, which is basically kind of getting an idea of where where we think we've had a lot of focus, where the activity we know are happening. And just say that Lauren Dobson-Hughes was down to help us with that, but unfortunately her daughter is ill, so she's going to be popping in and out of the conversation with us today. And so I'll be leading that instead. And then we're going to go into campaigns initiatives, which again is where you can share ideas and plans that you have around G7. We'll then have a break, and then we're going to come back and look at joint advocacy initiatives, which is really looking at how we as a group can contribute to doing some joint top line stuff, some key sort of lobbying events. We'll have next steps. Toko from Uniting to Combat NTDs is going to give us a wrap up, as her group has been sponsoring and supporting with the tech people, which is fantastic. And that'll be the end of the day. So we're looking hopefully to wrap up by 11:15 Eastern Standard Time. And we'll keep it sharp and snappy, and a couple breaks in the way so we don't tire out too much. Just going to say, any questions from that? We still got people joining us, but any quick questions? All right, people are happy with that? If you want to ask a question, use the raise your hand or clap or some indicator on your screen, and we'll go from there. Excellent. Just a reminder to people joining the chat, open your Jamboard. The links are in the Jamboard again. It links in the chat to the Jamboard. We're going to be using that for capturing notes. Also, if you could change your name on the screen, if you have an organizational name only or telephone line, to your name, so that helps us know who is who. Brilliant. So I am going to call on the first working group report back, and that is going to be climate. And Eddie, I should check if Eddie's online first, actually.
Yeah, I'm here. Excellent. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Cool. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so Kel, it's a 3 minutes or 5 minutes update?
Well, if you need 5 minutes, take 5 minutes.
No, I just wanted to know how much content you wanted me to share. But essentially, the climate workshop went really, really well. We had about 33 people. We had a conversation first about what climate meant for the next year's G7, taking into consideration this year's um, work on climate from both the G7 on the G20, and we can just, say that work was completely absent. And then we went specifically into a bit more of a detail of how that work on climate in 2021 could look like, taking into consideration past experiences on G7, but also looking at the different moments that were taking place in 2021. So essentially, when when we looked back, we started at the creation of the G7 Energy and Climate Working Group. We looked at how climate was a contentious priority both in the French G7 summit and in the Canadian one. We also looked at the geopolitical element of climate, which, along with trade, was a contentious issue when while Donald Trump was president of the United States and is president of the United States. And we also took a broad perspective to ask ourselves how climate was a cross-cutting part of next year's G7. Alden is also here as well. We also had a discussion about the work that the G7 Energy and Climate Working Group within the Global Task Force can continue to communicate with other networks that are working on this. And so, beginning with UK groups, so the Bond Network, also working with Climate Action Network International, that is following both the G7 and the G20. And there is a G20 working group within Climate Action Network International as well. And also working with ICP, with the International Climate Policy Network, which works much more on the inside game policy making. And so one of the key understandings was the importance to use the G7 Energy and Climate Working Group to communicate, to exchange information as complete as possible, both in the context of what's happening within the energy, environment, climate tracks of next year's G7, both in terms of how priorities evolve within the Sherpa office, but also on how climate is a cross-cutting priority for the other constituencies, C7, B7, L7, W7, etc. We also did a bit of an exercise asking questions about prioritization of specific topics, and of course, some of them they build back on work that has been done, for example, on fossil fuel subsidies, on sustainable finance.
Hey, Eddie, we've lost you there. Don't know if you still can hear us. Can anybody else hear? John, can you hear anybody?
Yep, we can hear.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear.
Was that me? Sorry. Continue on, Eddie. Sorry I interrupted. I couldn't hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay. So essentially what I said, the last thing that I wanted to say was how important it was for us to understand that during this COVID pandemic, there is a key priority for us to be much more cross-cutting. So making sure we make linkages between climate and health, making sure we make linkages with climate and biodiversity, and we understand that the priority out of the four pillars that the UK government has already mentioned, pandemic preparedness, climate change, gender, and build back better and recovery, climate will be part of those four pillars. And so we had an exercise with colleagues on the call to think along those lines, how climate is also a cross-cutting priority, and the next steps The G7 Energy and Climate Working Group has created a steering group, which will be meeting regularly to discuss, the evolution of the agenda of the UK G7 presidency, and we'll be meeting in December. We know that that there are still details to be dealt at the UK level before releasing their agenda. And the big group is going to meet again in January. And it's not going to be just Canada who's going to be leading this work. We'll be doing that with E3G, the colleagues from E3G, and a couple of other colleagues who will be part of that steering group. Alden also is going to be part of that steering group as well. So that's where we are at the moment, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Excellent. So first of all, any contributions from other people on that group, or any issues that you want to stress, or something that you feel should be mentioned?
Yeah, it's Alden Meyer. Just to add, I think we did discuss the integration between the G7 and the G20 processes, because some things may incubate in the G7 and then pivot over to the Italian G20. And of course, with the UK and Italy sort of co-hosting COP26, that should be a pretty seamless process, hopefully. But the challenges are a little harder with some of the laggard countries in the G20, like the Saudis, Russia, Turkey, etc. So we did talk about that, sort of how to use the two forums and divide up issues.
Great, thanks for that, Alden. Any other questions to the group? Any clarifications? Nope. Okay, I'm going to call on Toko to come back to us and report on global health and COVID-19.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So thanks for that. I think we really had good participation in our group, about 35 people who turned up and actively participated. It was a really engaging conversation, and we had many areas of alignment. I think we started off by reflecting on previous G7 commitments on global health, to see how global health has generally been represented in G7. And what's very clear is that it hasn't really had a strong feature, even though G7 has been responsible for the setting up of the Global Fund and other big initiatives that it has been leading replenishment on. It doesn't have a solid grounding. So this is something that we reflected on, and is entirely at the gift of the host president, and then with other countries either supporting or not supporting. And we feel that this opportunity of COVID-19 really underscores the importance of countries preparing, particularly from a pandemic preparedness, strong health systems, which COVID-19 has really demonstrated how health is fundamental for economic development. It's essential for everything else. So on that basis, there was a strong recommendation from our group as one of the key asks that we should ensure that global health is established as a standing agenda on at the G7 meetings. So that's something that came very earlier on in our conversations as a group, just reflecting on previous commitments, some that have had money behind them, or some that have just been language and words, but with no solid financial support behind them. So that was a really interesting conversation from that perspective. Again, going back and reflecting on previous commitments, we then had a conversation about the extent to which we want to use this G7 as an accountability mechanism for previous global health commitments in G7. So that was something that came up, that potentially looking at what was committed before, to what extent do we use G7 to make sure that those commitments are met, especially I think everybody, or at least on this group, if not will circulate it, the Biarritz report has a scorecard showing progress on some of the commitments. And clearly there is an accountability mechanism to track progress against previous commitments, but it shouldn't just be left to a report, it has to be proactively followed up with a mechanism to understand what's actually being proactively done to meet those commitments. So a lot of the disease-specific commitments will fall under this bucket of accountability for previous global health commitments. And then the conversation, which was interesting, I think where we aligned on pretty quickly, was the need to really think much more holistically and think about how are we linking in with G20, how are we linking in with COP26 and some of the other areas, given the UK's presidency and the fact that they will have a whole series of things that they're leading on in 2021. And potentially they'll be looking at how they all fit into each other. So with that in mind, how do we make sure that what we're coming up with from a health perspective fits in with some of the climate change agenda and also what we know will be a big COVID-19 focus. So that's something that we talked about. On COVID-19, everybody recognizes that COVID-19 is likely to basically take over the stage and be the big thing that's on the agenda. So the group really felt strongly that as part of our advocacy efforts, we should ensure that health discussions are not just COVID focused, but that there is also a focus around commitment to strengthen health systems, which clearly COVID-19 has demonstrated the impact of weaker systems and the ability to respond to pandemics. Another point which links into the previous presentation was the G20, G7 alignment and making sure that we are really looking at this as a dual G7, G20 policy advocacy ask. There were some thoughts within our group whether G20 could be seen as a home for global health, particularly given the health summit that the EU is going to be hosting alongside Italy next year. So understanding how that works will be key. I think we also valued the way this meeting sort of fell in with the bond meeting that was facilitated, and the timing really worked well, particularly from an Intel gathering. What that Intel also showed us is that we're still much earlier on in conversations. We know bits and pieces from conversations with different people, but there is yet not a solid government position on their priorities. So although health systems strengthening is seen as a potential focus area, a lot, I think, is still TBD. So we're expecting a meeting, I think, around Jan, when we might know what's happening. So in terms of next steps for us, in preparation of the Shepherds meeting in January, we are going to be producing a brief with policy asks, working very closely with our colleagues in the UK Action for Global Health. And we'll have a meeting in December before everybody breaks for Christmas. I think we're proposing the 10th or 11th of December, but we'll come to everybody with a date for that. And then after that, we'll be looking at monthly meetings leading up to G7 and G20. So I think there is this commitment for this group to potentially carry on and do the dual G7, G20 work. So I would invite some of my health colleagues to add what I may have missed from this presentation.
Excellent. Thanks, Toko. Any comments, any other contributions from people who are at that meeting? Marvin's giving you a thumbs up, so that's good. And he's also having lunch. Any other conversations or contributions? Okay. Can I just go back to just the climate group? Eddie, I know your group talked about ways of working and how you were going to engage. Can I ask that you throw that on the Post-it note on the Jamboard so we can just also capture that? I'm using the Jamboard for capturing notes. Obviously, we're recording this whole thing, but we're going to use that. So if you can throw anything there or any points you don't think got captured on the Jamboard, that'd be great. Excellent.
Cal, just one quick question for Toko. That was excellent report, but I'm wondering, does the group have a set of one or two key priorities for that Italian EU Leaders Summit next spring or summer? Obviously, when you get leaders together on a focused issue, there's an opportunity to really put a spotlight on and exert some pressure for some breakthroughs, but I don't know what the thinking of the group on that.
So that's a great question. We didn't actually think about at this particular point. We have a whole bunch of ideas that we were looking at, but we haven't come up with a specific idea that we might put for Italy. I think that could potentially come from the work that we're doing in December. We had some really good conversations, including some thematic areas that we would want to look at, which we think will be a big focus for a number of our G7 countries. And we just need to establish the extent to which that's also a focus for G20, including things like One Health. What does that mean for the UK, US, and other countries? So we would be really keen to see how we can really make use of the Italy Health Summit and come up with a strong ask for that. So that's a really good shout out.
Great, thanks. And just to note, some of the folks in the Climate and Energy Group hope to have a meeting with the Italian Sherpa private meeting sometime in December. So if you have thinking that we can feed in, we should all be reinforcing each other's agendas, obviously, when we have issue-specific meetings with either the UK or Italy. So, you know, anything you have just to share with the group, we can try to reinforce when we have those meetings.
That's great. Thank you very much, Alden. We'll definitely take you up on that.
Hi, and it's Kelly. Maybe an idea would be to have each working group give you, say, top 3 priority sort of calls to actions for that meeting. It's a bit advanced, and we know we're accelerating, but since you have that ideal opportunity, give you some a quick brief from across the working groups that you have in your back pocket, should you have the opportunity to share them.
Yeah, that's great. Sort of the elevator speech for each issue.
Yeah.
Perfect. So
Super.
I'm going to ask Joe or Ope, can you take one of the blank pages at the end of Jamboard and put next steps? I should have made one and add that point. That'd be fantastic. Thank you. For good on health, let's move on to women and gender. Jessica or Lyrica giving the report back on this?
Hi. So this is the Gender Equality Working Group. And just sort of answering the questions that Kel had asked us to speak to. First of all, the question, I'm going to take these off actually. The question was, how important is this G7 on gender equality? And I think the thing to get is that the UK government prides itself in its work on gender equality, which is different from saying that it does good work on gender equality, but it thinks it does. And it's very important to the UK government that it's seen as a leader on this issue on the global stage. So in that sense, that gives us potentially an opening, I think, particularly because there's some potentially healthy competition between the Canadians and the UK governments as to who is better on gender equality, and we'll certainly use that, try and play that off. As far as we understand it, there's going to be 3 main ways in which gender equality is likely to feature across the summit narrative. The first is on girls' education, and our Prime Minister is extremely interested in girls' education. The second, obviously, is within COVID economic recovery. And it is the case that at the moment, at least, they're saying that they recognise that there is a gender analysis that's needed within the COVID economic recovery discussions, although no further than that. And what they might mean by that, I think, is still open. The third area, obviously, is that climate change is going to be a priority for the UK G7, not least because they're also president of COP26, and they're certainly trying to recycle work to do the same kind of work on climate in the G7 and in COP26. And we have a number of groups in the UK who are working specifically on gender and climate change. And also within the UK government, there is a strand of people who are working specifically on gender and climate change. So while the underlying politics of the British government is not conducive to what we're trying to do necessarily, there are certainly opportunities to try to push some of our issues. Within the UK, there are a lot of people working on gender equality and the G7, and we're already networked in with a number of you and with other people outside this group. The other thing I just wanted to say is that one of the things that we really want to do is to bring in women's rights activists from the Global South into the discussion about gender equality and the G7, because quite often they're missing. In terms of the issues that we will prioritise, The first one, not surprisingly, is COVID economic recovery and trying to get a gender analysis within COVID economic recovery. Within that, one of the key asks will be around the care economy, unpaid care, and the importance of care work within economic recovery. And we're just trying to work out now what the elevator pitch is, if you like, around investment in social infrastructure. We'll also be looking to work on the issue of decent work, particularly with the L7, and we know that that's going to be a priority for the L7. It's also a priority for people working on it. So that kind of cluster of economic issues is the first one. The second one is climate, and we would certainly be really keen to have a feminist analysis within the climate change work, and things around gender responsive finance, but also looking at access to finance, who's getting access to that finance, and a whole lot of other issues besides. The third one, obviously, is girls' education. And I know that the education working group was touching on this. I can see us working really closely with that working group. There's one of the things that we try to do is to argue that girls' education should not be seen as a proxy for gender equality work. And one of the things that I think we're all worried about in the next G7 is that when you ask the question, what are you doing on gender equality, the answer is girls' education, and that's not enough, and we need to broaden out that analysis. And as far as I understand it, the education working group feels the same way. So I think there's some really good synergies on that. Then on issues that aren't currently on the G7 agenda, but there are people who are wanting to put it on there, is issues around women, peace and security, and obviously also around sexual and reproductive health and rights, and trying to roll back the backlash that was happening under Trump and see where the G7 is a potential area there. Obviously, that is a lot of different asks, because gender equality cuts across absolutely everything. There is nothing for which gender equality is not pertinent. So one of the things that we as a group will need to do is to work out which things we put forward as a gender ask and which things we work on with other people, like climate, like education, where we're trying to do a gender analysis or a feminist analysis of those issues. The other thing that's slightly different about the gender equality group is that we also have the W7, and my organisation, Gender and Development Network, is co-chairing the W7 along with another UK network, GAPS. What we're going to do is make sure that everything that we do in this group feeds in to the W7, and that there is an interaction between those two things. There will be a W7 summit. We're pushing this year for that to be as early as possible in the year. In previous years, the W7 summit has tended to happen after the Leaders Summit, which is obviously not very strategic. In terms of how this group will actually work, we have got the Google group going. We will have Zoom meetings where we share intel about what each other's Sherpas are doing. And in particular on gender equality, we do try and kind of play each other off, so that if we hear that one government is putting forward something that is potentially useful, we then go back to another government and say, they're doing this, what are you going to do that, playing off. So that will be the intelligence sharing part of it. Then, as we've done in previous years, we will use Google Docs to first of all develop up the policy asks and then break them down again into the elevator pitch, and to try to get a smaller number of priorities across those, which will then feed into the W7. As part of the work that the W7 is doing, we'll also put out a briefing, hopefully in January, backing up some of those core asks, ideally before the first Sherpas meeting. So I haven't gone into a lot of detail on the specific asks, but that's because there's a lot of them, because we cross-cut across everything. But the key areas that we will cross-cut with are COVID economic recovery, climate, and girls' education. I've seen this, okay, I've just seen the question as well. So the Gender Equality Advisory Council, which was first set up under the Canadian presidency and further complicates the work on gender, because there is this group of sort of known women who meet with the Sherpas and have a sort of status above the status of the W7 and so on. What we're trying to do this year, and in fact I've got a meeting tomorrow on this with our government, is trying to make sure that the right people get onto the Gender Equality Advisory Council. Because in the past, what people have tried to do is to influence the council once it's formed. We're trying to go earlier in that and actually influence who's going to be on the council. We have also, as part of the W7 process, discussed with our government, the Cabinet Office in our government, making sure that there are formal meetings between the W7 and GIAC, and making sure that there are possibly 2 representatives from the W7 on GIAC. But we'd rather just make sure that GIAC's good. I'm just seeing if there's a. I'm not sure if this was a suggestion to me, but there's another thing which is certainly relevant to the gender work, which is one of the things that we'll certainly try and do is that those people who are working on gender will make sure that we have a named person on each of the other groups to make sure that that cross-cutting happens. I think that's everything from the chat box.
Excellent. Any other questions from people to contribute to that?
I mean, for me, just this interaction actually absolutely works, that you say you're linking into everything. I mean, this unpaid care that's happening now during COVID is something definitely worth mentioning, that we as a health group should have in the back of our minds, and you certainly should also remind us. But, you know, I think there that communication is very important, and to have a
You froze on us, Marvin. Can you give us that last point?
Oh, sorry. It was just, I think it's an excellent idea actually to have a point person in each working group that helps reminding us and giving us this lens. Thank you very much, Jessica and the others.
So there's a final comment from Anya saying, Jessica, setting up the healthy competition between Canada and UK is a good idea. Are you thinking about this for France as well? Yes, great. Just to say, if anybody wants to join any of the working groups, throw it in the chat. Excellent. Might be lost. Email me and I can pair you up with the right working group. So anybody who thinks I want to be on a different working group, give me a shout. I can do that. And secondly, on coming back to sort of, you know, the connections between the working groups, and that is the role of the task force. We will be meeting once a month. We will talk about the end, the next steps. But that is when the different working groups can come back, report what they're hearing, and we can really build those linkages and make sure everyone is incorporating the key aspects as we go through in our advocacy work. So that is the role of the overarching task force, to support interconnections between the working groups. So want to move now on to education. Any, who's going to report back on education? There we go. Anya.
Hi, everyone. Yep. Anya and I will report back together if that's all right. So yeah, we had a really positive working group meeting. It started out with a discussion of kind of placing the G7 in the broader context of 2021, which is going to be a huge year for education, with kind of key moments across the year. So not looking at the G7 as a silo, but within the broader narrative of education as a priority, which of course includes Generation Equality Forum, where we know education is going to be important. Obviously, there'll be the G7, and the UK government have told us that girls' education is a big priority, with the potential for an education forum in the margins of the G7. There's also the GPE replenishment, which comes a month after the G7, so it's going to be a big moment, and seeing it as a stepping stone. There's CHOGM, and then there's also obviously COP26. And again, with the UK government hosting COP, we know that girls' education will be a key priority there. So we're kind of talking, I think Iona referred to it as a kind of scaffolding of events. So that's just to kind of put it in the context. And I'll let Anya give an overview of the kind of key themes, but I think Jess has already outlined this, but a core message that came out of the conversation was kind of seeing girls' education, using the girls' education priority lens, but actually broadening that out to gender equality, which is where I think a lot of the overlap and coordination with the other working groups will be absolutely critical. So looking at, structural barriers that girls and boys face in terms of getting into education, and kind of, using girls' education as that core lens to look at the broader gender equality piece. I'll let Anya talk about the themes.
Thanks, Anna. We're an easy duo to remember. Anna and Anya. So we had a really great session, lots of really interesting discussion, really rich discussion, and we sort of asked the group to put themselves in July 2021 and think about what they were going to be celebrating. Like, let's get pie in the sky. Let's really think about what's July 2021 going to look like for us. And we used that to pull out some key themes, which are many, and we will be kind of paring them down or kind of figuring out what that really looks like shortly. But it starts with education system strengthening and kind of the holistic approach to education. Then financing, both in terms of domestic financing, which is where we cut across with the economy, and of course ODA. Then a bit about youth engagement, disability and inclusion, climate change, education in emergencies or humanitarian education, and comprehensive sexuality education. And that's where what Anna mentioned, we're kind of having that discussion around is gender equality kind of mainstreamed across, or is it a kind of standalone ask in itself? And that's what we really wanted to highlight. I think Jessica has already clearly said, we see this platform of girls' education as such a strong commitment from the government, and we're really thinking about how we use that platform, that commitment to elevate not only our education asks, but also asks across the other themes as well. So whether that's climate change, making that really clear link between gender, as Jessica said, between climate change, as Eddie said, and between girls' education, and making sure that we're really making those things clear. We're committed kind of as a group, it sounded like very much to me, to use the platform that we're offered by girls' education to also elevate other issues as much as possible, including in climate, but also in terms of inclusiveness. There's a lot of interest in ensuring that we're disability inclusive, particularly building on commitments that the government has also made to inclusive education, and noting the 2022 inclusive disability conference, that the UK hosted the previous one. Also, COVID, of course, and educational disruption, and then with building back better in the economy, that's where we tie back into financing, and looking at educational investment. As Anna said, there's lots of opportunities for investment, and there's going to be lots of talk about that, but how do we make that work in a holistic sense? So we're keen to work across themes, and then in terms of our ways of working, we'll be meeting again in December to kind of really start hashing out tactics, and kind of, as I think, can't quite remember who it was who talked about, it was Jessica actually, who talked about that, like Google Doc, and how we're going to have all of that work and make sense. We kind of need to get a little bit more onto that in December, and then we're looking at monthly meetings as a group. But yeah, I think that's kind of our very quick whistle-stop tour of our meeting. But of course, very happy to take questions and very happy to take ideas as well.
May I jump in, Anya? Is that okay? The other thing that we spoke about is the emphasis on public provision of education, because we know that the UK government is a pretty big proponent of privatization in education. So I think that will be important for a group to stand pretty firm on the fact that we're advocating for. When we talk about system strengthening, we're talking about strengthening public systems and public education. So just wanted to mention that.
Oh, can I just add in here? Sorry, I think another kind of overlap thing, because I really agree with Yona and the whole thing around not just what issues are they working on, but how are they working on it, and the role of private finance versus public services is going to be a really major one for the UK. The other thing I just wanted to mention that I thought was really interesting that came out of the education working group was the fact that there's a sort of, maybe just a rumor at this point, but that girls' education and climate change may be dealt with under the same kind of umbrella. And certainly I've heard that they're looking to try, and the UK government is looking to try to address issues together, which can always be really dangerous because you can get the wrong intersection between two issues. And they're potentially looking at girls' education and climate change together, which could be extremely dangerous in that could have a kind of attack on reproductive rights type approach of girls' education leads to a fall in population growth. But this is a common thing for the UK government to do, is to combine two issues and end up with something that really isn't sensible and is potentially dangerous. So worth looking out for among the climate change people.
Interesting point, and I think that sort of underlines the intelligence we need to do and the work that we need to do before the first Sherpa meeting, which we expect to happen sometime in January, when they'll nail down the agenda and they'll start proposing this. We need to put some strong messaging into the government saying this will be problematic and not a good way of working. So just, again, going into next steps, that's kind of something we need to perhaps record. Any other questions coming from that on education? Again, I'm capturing some people are listing in their chat room which groups they want to join. I'm making a list of that and hopefully get back to you. If I haven't put you into those groups, just email if I've missed you. But we will move on now to food security and nutrition and ag, and Callum.
Hi, Kel. Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. Noting we've only got a few minutes until the break, so I'll try and be really quick to get everyone the chance to step away from their laptops. So in terms of some of the pointers, Kel, that you were interested to hear back from us, how important is the G7 to nutrition and agriculture and food security? We know it's an issue for the UK for their presidency, particularly food security. So it provides a good avenue for policy engagement on that issue of the three, and to make sure that whatever they are thinking about within that framework can be as strong as effective as possible, but also it provides an entry point for nutrition and agriculture, so we can think about comprehensive and effective responses. Having said that, I think for all of the issues that this working group looks at, 2021 is already looking to be a busy year. There are a number of events above the usual annual cycle of events which are taking place, which are quite relevant. So everyone has already mentioned COP26 obviously has a clear link to food security, nutrition and agriculture. But there is also the UN Food Systems Summit taking place in Q3 of next year, and the delayed Tokyo Nutrition for Growth Summit taking place in December of next year. But at the same time, it's also going to be a big year in terms of the impact of the pandemic on the issues that we're working on. We're expecting to see a dramatically worsened landscape. So because of that, and because the G7 countries will likely be major targets for those other additional summits taking place next year, there was a bit of thought and discussion as to how the G7 process fits into that year-long approach, and whether momentum and engagement is crucial in building up to other moments, or with the summit it's crucial in itself at getting tangible financing and policy outcomes. So it may be that we do a bit of both for this working group, and we think about building momentum to other things upcoming, and solidifying on a couple of quite tangible policy outcomes that we can achieve. So in terms of what that might look like, there was real strong agreement on the need on a few areas, but I've kind of pulled out three from the JAM board, which I think, Kel, you've shared as well. Firstly is on famine prevention, and with integrated treatment and prevention of acute malnutrition. The predictions of 80% increases in acute food insecurity in 5 countries are currently on the brink of famine. So it's clearly a huge issue, and the G7 have a role to play in stopping that happening. Secondly, on prioritizing nutrition through COVID response packages, including by protecting essential nutrition services, nutritious food security packages, and nutrition inclusive social protection programs, which can then be strengthened long term, and that extends into food security and agriculture, but with the nutrition as a key component of that. And then finally, and an area that needs a bit more work is reviewing previous G7 commitments and vision statements, and seeing where we are with them in terms of progress and what the impact of the pandemic will be on that. So in particular, a stocktake of the 2015 commitment to lift 500 million people out of hunger and malnutrition by 2030, and the 2016 vision for action on food security and nutrition, which is aimed to achieve that commitment. And also included within this area is reflecting on the 2008 creation of GASP as a G7 initiative, which had a replenishment earlier on this year, but due to the pandemic wasn't perhaps given the attention that it would have been otherwise, and they're still looking for financing. In terms of convergence, we're really interested in seeing where there is alignment in other areas of work, and it's useful to have heard other people talking about similar issues as well, notably from our side, focusing on health, where most of the time essential nutrition services are delivered through health systems, and good nutrition is vital for immune system functioning. With the climate work, noting that food systems drive and is driven by climate, and any outcomes will need to be climate sensitive, but also see good food as a focus, that work with agriculture as well. Debt and debt relief, and thinking about the wider macroeconomic impacts of the pandemic, knowing that malnutrition has quite strong links to stunting economic growth as well as stunting human development, and so failure to act there will likely deepen and lengthen any economic impacts of the pandemic. And also in education, seeing that hunger and malnutrition are strong barriers for access, particularly for girls and adolescents. In terms of the key dates and processes moving forward, we're looking to regroup in early December, once members have had a bit more time to reflect on the session this week and to analyse the G7's vision processes, and also to link that in with GASP and see whether there's any alignment that crosses over. We'll then look to build a first iteration of a joint policy position off the back of that meeting, remaining closely linked with the similar bond group focusing on the same issues. And also then following that, some reflection on priorities, and the prioritization of this process may be needed depending on what happens at upcoming external events, such as the Nutrition Moment that's being organised by the Government of Canada in December, and the rescheduled Committee on World Food Security in February of next year. And they should provide a bit more context about what happens moving forward. And I'll stop there.
Excellent. Sorry, if you see me typing as I'm actually trying to capture these points in the sticky notes on Jamboard, so I'm not actually doing my emails. Excellent. Thank you, Callum. That was a great overview of that. Any questions or any further comments from people in that working group?
Oh, hi. It's Elizabeth here. Thank you. And thank you, Callum, for the summary. It's extremely comprehensive, and it was a really active working group. What I just wanted to say is, is there going to be a report that sort of captures these points besides the Jamboard from the working group, some kind, not report, but like a note for the record or something, because it's going quite quickly, and it'd be nice to know that. Thank you.
Callum, I can't remember. How are you doing your notes? I can't remember that one.
Sorry, yeah. So definitely that will be looking to be shared imminently, based on the end of this strategy session today, to see where that aligns, and then we can look to pull that together and share that around the working group. And if there's interest, then also for the wider task force to see that, then really happy to share that more widely.
Yeah, that would be great. And if all the task force, the working group chairs can email me the links and stuff, and I'll put that a central place. We're going to create maybe on the Sherpa Times, I'll have a separate place to G7 where we can click all these links, because we have a lot of Google Docs, a lot of live documents, but keeping that transparency, helping that cross-cutting will be by sharing the notes across the different groups so everyone can see what's going on. Okay, everyone.
I have a question, if you don't mind. This is Katie from WaterAid. Question for Callum, but maybe also for the whole group. You mentioned social protection, nutrition sensitive social protection, and I'm wondering whether people think social protection might be an entry point for kind of a way to bring together a lot of the different issues that we're talking about. I understand that at least some people at the FCDO are talking about it as a priority, but not sure whether that will filter up to UK's G7 priorities or not, but just whether we think social protection could be a way of sort of bringing together a lot of the issues that we're focusing on in kind of a collective ask, or not, I guess, is the question. Thanks.
Anyone any comments on that?
Yeah, I could come in on that. I think social protection certainly cuts across some of the work that we're doing on gender equality. What I'd be slightly wary of is that I think in some extent social protection is the easiest part, not easy, but easier than some of the other asks that we might have. And so we probably would not want to have that as our top ask, because I think it would be relatively easy, certainly in the UK, that they'll focus on
a small amount of social protection rather than some of the investment in social infrastructure and unpaid care issues that we really want to raise. So it's a kind of yes and no answer.
Any comments on that? Okay, sorry, my mouse went crazy. I've captured that. I think that's something to take a look at and think through, especially if the SEDO is looking at avenue, to see again how if that could be a constructive way of entry, but taking Jessica's point that might be a diversion, and then we'll end up with a lesser outcome. So we can evaluate that, but keep tracking that because I think it's quite interesting.
Sorry, Cal, can I jump in? It's Jenny from Surveyors in the UK. Just another theme that I don't think anyone mentioned, but we know was a stated UK priority in the Conservative manifesto, is ending preventable deaths. And we are starting to see trickles of those commitments coming to fruition. Most recently with a new aid match programme, which references ending preventable deaths as kind of a priority theme area, although we haven't seen what we were originally promised, which was kind of not a strategy, but an action plan on ending preventable deaths. But I wonder how, I think for health, I work on HIV and within that financing for the Global Fund, and within that financing for the Global Fund in light of COVID. So that's something that we're really thinking about in terms of like an umbrella to capture our issues in. And I think it could be relevant not only to health, but to some of these other cross-cutting areas as well. So yeah, sorry, just similarly along the lines of social protection is kind of a theme that wasn't covered. I wonder how we capitalise on the UK's ending preventable deaths manifesto commitment.
Again, another interesting point. Any comments on that? Initial comments?
Hi, Kel, it's Callum again. I would agree with Jenny on that. I think, and actually, I think the last time Jenny and I saw each other was at an event in Parliament where DFID then was due to launch its ending preventable death strategy quite imminently, and that was in March. So it's definitely something that is still rumbling in the background, and it's definitely something that would sit alongside some of the interests of the Food Security, Nutrition and Agriculture Working Group as well. It aligns really neatly, and it's a good crossover with some of the health side of things for messaging and policy commitments as well. So would just support Jenny in that.
Right, any other comments? And maybe that's something when we go forward, we can take a look at there's some umbrella groupings, so like preventable deaths that can be the bridge between these different working groups that we can use to give concrete sort of connectors between them. Something to think about as we go forward. I'm going to wrap up there. I'm going to encourage during the break, the leads, the chairs to go over the Jamboard to make sure I capture all the points. And if possible, if you did have your 3 priority areas, I think I've captured some of them. I know I haven't captured all of them. I know there's actually a blank on education. So if you could take a look at that, Anya, now that'd be great. Because I missed that. If we could get the 3 top ones, that'd be really useful and to capture that. But I think all in all, that was an excellent feedback and great discussion. Any other comments? Okay, so we're going to take a 10-minute break. Please come back at 10 minutes past the hour, and we'll start with the next session, which is our timeline. So 10 minutes past the hour, back here.
Hi, Natalie. Jetzt haben wir hier 10 Minuten Pause und dachte ich, können wir das Ganze auch gleich bequatschen. Sorry, dass ich dich gerade eben weggedrückt habe. Der liebe Cal Currar, an den du dich vielleicht auch noch erinnerst, die sind wieder dabei und es ist wieder G7 und ja.
Hey, Marvin, your microphone.
Oh, sorry, Cal. My mic is still on. I was just telling Natalie that we met and greetings.
Say hello back to Natalie. It's a long time.
Yes, will do. Thanks for telling me.
No problem.
Can you remind me what time you'd like us back? I can't do the time difference. I'm not sure what time you're working on.
10 past the hour. I didn't give it time. See, I'm thinking.
So in 12 minutes.
9 minutes. On my computer.
Okay.
10 past 8. 10 past 8. I think you're on my time zone.
It's 1 p.m. here.
Oh, you're in UK. Sorry, I thought you were in Washington. Sorry.
Yeah. So you want us back in 10 minutes? Okay, fine.
Well, 10 past. So 9 minutes now. Okay, everyone. Don't know if everyone's back, but it is 10 past the hour, so I think we shall kick off. We're running 10 minutes late, but that is fine. We should pick it back as we go along. So, second thing of the thing is we're going to look at timelines. Now, there's a couple things here. Sorry, I'm open the right jam board. So there's a couple things here which, if you open up the Google Docs, there's a timeline there. You can take a look at one that's built. It's quite comprehensive with lots of different stuff. Ideally, this to be a live document. We're going to keep adding stuff, so it's going to build, and it's going to be very informative for us. I have basically global events. I have the events broken down by our key issues. And then I have country events, and then I ideally have some organizational events, which we'll come to later, and we'll have a really sort of really good calendar there. But what we want to do here, and John's going to help us through this, is really bring up what we think will be the key G7 moments and lobbying moments and advocacy moments over the next period for us, and really identify them. The timeline actually goes into later 2021 because we know we're doing some arching to the G20, and then we're going to do some stuff at the COP, so just going to do that as well. But as Alden pointed out, the EU, and I forget the actual meeting, one of the EU meetings would be a key moment to do some lobbying. So let's start identifying that. So to make that happen, I am going to do two things, and hopefully this will go seamlessly. I'm going to share my screen so everyone can see as we go along, but please do take a look at Jamboard as well. And John can take us through that. And John, I'll hand over to you to start us off. I think that's working. John, you're on mute.
Okay, there we go. Thanks, Cal. This is John Ruthroff in Washington. Just a couple of things as we begin. If people looked at the G7 calendar from 2019 when France hosted it, the summit wasn't held until August. At this point, we think, via Bond's information, and we thank Kit Dory for that, that the summit will probably be in June, which shrinks our timeline a couple of months. So what is really key is for us to figure out which of the meetings prior to the lead up to the summit. The summit itself, as we know, is mostly a photo op, and the decisions are made well beforehand. So we'll need to keep our intelligence keen to figure out when those key meetings are happening. We understand that there'll be a Sherpa tour probably in January, and with the summit probably in June, although that could get pushed back given the pandemic and all, as is a tour. And at this point, as Jessica pointed out, we're going to try and have the W7 early in 2021 and the Civil Society 7 probably March or April. So what we need to do is to look at when we want to have our policy papers ready to present to the 7 governments prior to the meetings where they're going to be discussed. And those are often meetings, for example, in the French calendar, the interior ministers met in April, the foreign affairs ministers met in April, environment in May, health the end of May, labor the beginning of June, and civil society didn't meet till July. But if the summit's in June, then we have to speed up our process so that we have our material to the participants prior to those meetings. So do people want to discuss, talk about when they want to have those done and when they can try and have a target for policy briefs that we want to use for advocating?
So this is free for all. Please go ahead and contribute. And also, just to say, in this session, because we were much more interactive, you want to turn your videos on so we can see some faces and have some dialogue. brilliant. If you don't feel comfortable turning your video on, fully understand, but if you can, it helps create the dynamic rather than this just sort of a one-way discussion. The Jamboard is open, and I'm sharing my screen. Everybody can see my screen?
Comes up here.
Cool. So now we're just going to look to populate what we, so a whole, in this, let's sort of a whole bunch of events that we think are happening, and then we can perhaps figure out which ones we think are sort of going to be key to various issues or key to sort of a joint task force approach, that there's the cross-issue approach. So anybody want to throw out some ideas or throw them on the Jamboard? Let's kick this off.
Cal, can I ask a question before we get into that? So first of all, when does the G7 presidency get handed over? Has that happened already? And second of all, Sherpa tour, that seems to be like the first kind of thing. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that is? And is that an opportunity to influence? I understand that the Sherpas are very important figures in this process. Can you tell us a little bit about these various moments that John has outlined, and how influential you see them, against each other? Like, so is the Sherpa tour a really influential moment versus something else? That would be helpful.
Yeah. John, do you want to feed into this? I'm happy to feed
Sure, I'll start, but Cal and Kit also please add in. So the presidency changes January 1st. Obviously, there was none this year, so there's not much of a handover since there were no meetings. The Sherpa tour, Kit may have a better sense than I do. My sense is that it's more the UK Sherpa visiting the Sherpas and their team in each of the G7 countries. I would think they'll discuss the agenda, figure out when meetings are going to be, things like that. I'm not aware of that being a decision-making meeting in terms of the policy issues that we're trying to address. Kit or Kel, do you have any sense of anything different than that?
I just, all it was that they said that it was something that the Sherpa wanted to do in January, so it was COVID allowing, so that might be wishful thinking, but I don't know how influential those meetings have been in the past and what they could be used for this time.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll come in here, and then we'll come to you, Eddie. Just to say that the Sherpa, way back when, in 2005, and we're going back some time here, and apologies for sort of ancient history, but the UK government did do a very effective Sherpa tour to all the G7 countries, where he met with the party groups and discussed the agenda and had a good dialogue. And I think that was seen as a good engagement. Now, whether or not the Sherpa tour would include meeting with civil society is not known, but definitely, as John said, they will go to capitals if COVID allowing, to meet with the teams that are working on the G7, do some lobbying around their achieving their goals and try to use their political capital to achieve some outcomes. The Sherpas overall, in terms of the lobbying, they're kind of, for us, they're our main event. Obviously the leaders are key and very important, and definitely if we can get the ear of Boris Johnson, that's brilliant. But in the meantime, the Sherpas and the Sherpa teams are the ones that are actually drafting the communiques. They're ones that are doing the negotiations. They're looking for ideas. They're putting forward proposals. They're countering proposals that they don't like from other G7s. And so that's the process. And so just to go through a little bit of background, the first Sherpa meeting is in January, and that's traditionally when the host will propose their agenda. So that's what they're working on now. They'll come together and saying, this is what we want to prioritize. It won't be a huge surprise to the other Sherpas, but there might be some details. And then there's a bit of haggling of what they agree should be the key moments, key events and key issues around that. And then they go away and they start negotiating. And negotiate, they probably will have, again, COVID allowing, 1 or 2, 3 meetings before the G7 Sherpa 7 itself. Again, there'll be meetings, they'll negotiate language. Usually in April, the meeting they have in April, they want to land the final text for the non-controversial issues. That's stuff that they can get pretty much agreement on. They have an idea of what other governments will contribute, leaving the really difficult stuff to the summits, which is needs political leaders weighing in to make the final calls, and that's when they do the overnight drafting, and it's all a bit of a rush and it's a bit intense. So that's kind of really the flow. And so the Sherpa events and Sherpa meetings are very key to us. In terms of influencing them, getting access is important, as we know, and Kit's been helping us with that. And as the UK Sherpa team works its way out and starts its engagement. But also within that, you had the finance ministers meetings and all the different ministerial meetings, which are key moments as well. So we do put a lot of emphasis on the Sherpas from our group, because we're an advocacy group primarily. People doing more public campaigning will be looking at different doing much more sort of visuals, and that would be focused perhaps on leaders and getting their attention. But that's the Sherpas is kind of where we focus. So that was a bit long, but that's where we're at.
So it would be very important for each of the national groups to develop a relationship as much as they can with the Sherpa team before they start meeting.
Yeah.
Here it's going to be a big change, obviously, in January 21st, hopefully. But in other countries, it'll be more predictable now to be able to figure out who's going to be in that team and hopefully have some relationships with them already.
Eddie, you had a hand up?
Yeah. Okay, just making sure my microphone is working.
It's on.
Is it? Cool, thank you. So, I mean, when we're thinking about the G7 timeline, I think there's more that we don't know that we know at this moment. And that is because the transition to the UK G7 presidency is uncertain. And this is something that I heard from the Canadian team last week. So I think focusing on specific ministerials at this moment might not be the more strategic approach when it comes to identifying a timeline. And I would rather, I think, the exercise here is for us to think about the first products that we're going to be producing early in the year that could influence the discussions that Sherpas are going to have. And so in terms of those first products, we also need to think about the sequence of what we know. So what we do know is the G7 summit, the head of a state summit, is going to take place in the summer. So, we also know that the first 2 months are transition months where there is a nomination of the different leads for different parts of the G7. So beginning by new Sherpas, sometimes it's the same Sherpa, but sometimes there are changes, leads for the different tracks. And so the UK is going to be announcing all this. They're going to be announcing, for example, the Gender Council. And so I think that we know. We also know that there are some geopolitical things that might influence. So the first 100 days of Biden, that is going to also shape the way in which the G7 is shaped. So that happens under the first 3 months. And we also know that the G20 takes place later in the year. So when we think about the different kind of products that we need to have, I think the first thing is a high level document from us on key priorities, key cross-cutting priorities early in the year that we can socialize with the Sherpa. I think then once we have a better understanding of the transition period and how the UK is structuring their G7 process, then we can focus a little bit more on the ministerials, particularly taking into consideration how those other big moments, the Biden first 100 days, the different nominations that the UK is going to do, and the different ministerials that are going to be announced, then I think it will be important for each of the G7 Global Task Force working groups to reconvene early in the year, and then for us to have a big discussion in February to see how the structure of work will influence the load of work afterwards. So my thinking right now is a little bit from like the thing, like the broadest thing ever, which is we don't know much, but there are some high level political moments that are going to shape the agenda. But we should reconvene to have this discussion again in February.
Good points, Eddie. Other thoughts and comments?
Oh, there's my dog. I'm going to mute.
He is a vote also, Cal.
Can I just so is that okay to come in?
Please do.
Just quick, it's Ben Margolis here in the UK. Just I want to flag one thing in terms of which might or might not be relevant for this timeline, which is less about the timing of these policy documents for Sherpas and conversations with Sherpas and country governments, and more about a campaigning timeline. So as we're mapping out what's necessary for the green recovery, for a global green, healthy, fair recovery in 2021, the earlier that we know what the priorities are going to be for G7, G20 and COP, the better, so we can do some of that cross-cutting work and make sure that messaging is being driven out by campaigning organizations as much as possible from January going right through the year. So I don't know whether that's the same document or something separate, or whether that's those kind of 3 headlines that Kel referred to earlier, or as early as we've got that kind of sense of where the priority is going to land in this timeline throughout the year is going to be super helpful for campaigners as well.
Good points, Ben. Let me just, we believe, and this isn't final, but we believe the UK is going to focus on climate and environment, economic recovery, including debt and social protection, health and COVID-19, open society, religious space and free trade, food security, and girls' education. Now, those aren't in stone, but according to discussions within the UK, our belief is that those will be the key issues that the UK government's going to focus on. Kit or others have any other information from the UK? It'd be great to know. Yes, go ahead, Kit.
Jessica was before me, so I can come in after Jessica, but add to that.
You go, because it's on, mine isn't quite on this, so you go first.
Go ahead, Jessica.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, obviously, that list it's kind of not really a priorities list. It's a very long list of potential priorities. So we just need to be cautious about that, that we don't know the final list yet. And also, I'm sure some of you will have seen, especially UK organisations, about the proposed cuts or proposed plan not to meet 0.7%. So any commitments that might be made with a financial ask to them are significantly under threat, as is the credibility of the UK government for next year to sort of promise anything really. So there are big challenges around that. But I think certainly speaking for the C7 in the UK, we have a timeline in place to have a sort of publish our priorities list or publish our briefing probably in February, depending on, it's slightly subject to the government's timeline, but to have that ready in February, but we'll be able to give an early indication before then. So speaking to the campaign's timeline, I know we're discussing that later, but we will be able to share kind of a provisional set of what our focus will be and the priorities that we'll be taking forwards. And a lot of that is in coordination with different groups within the global task force as well. So there's just a few different pieces there, but we're definitely looking to get something ready for early indication in January, and then kind of final document in February at some point. That's the current plan.
I just wanted to add in a couple of things from the UK perspective, if that's okay, and it'd be great if anyone from the UK can sort of add in more on this. But one thing is that in terms of the role of the Sherpas, one of the things that this particular administration is known for in the UK is that politicians not particularly listening to their civil servants. And so I think in terms of the sort of, we don't know yet, I think, what the influence of the Sherpas will be on the summit, but I would suggest it's likely to be less than it has been sometimes in previous years. From the way that this government works. The other thing is that, as those of you who've done this for a while know, in the UK, there are a lot of organisations that work on international development, really a lot. And there's always a really big campaign, which is not necessarily linked through to the policy work that a lot of us are doing. So when we talk about what's happening in the UK, it's a lot of different things. And I don't know whether anyone from any of the bigger INGOs in the UK on the call knows more about this, but as I understand it, the thinking around the kind of really big campaign, the kind of Make Poverty History type campaign, is really not, as I see it at the moment, in line with most of the policy proposals that we've been talking about, and is very much working towards a right-wing Conservative government and not taking it very far from where it is now, to be honest. So I do think, just for those of you who sort of don't know the UK context so well, you have to be kind of mindful of that we're dealing with a situation where the politicians probably have more say than normal, and where there'll be a big political campaign which doesn't necessarily feed through to the kind of policy work that this group is talking about. And I think it would be really good to try and make that connection a bit better, because otherwise all the hard work that we're doing will get undermined by really quite kind of top line messages. I'm just checking out, Kit agrees with me. I was a bit worried where I was talking out of turn, but Kit's agreeing with me. So I think you know, what I don't want to do is have people put a lot of time and energy into the kind of behind the scenes policy work that could just get wiped off by big campaigns that aren't connected in.
Good point, Jessica. Okay, other thoughts?
Marvin, I think you're coming in.
2 points, and also sorry for being late. This is running between 2 meetings. I mean, being wiped off, this has happened before, and I think it's a danger we always have to contend with. But sometimes what does happen is that nevertheless points that we make get translated over then to the next presidency. I mean, until this year, it was before the summit is, after the summit is before the summit, and often, quite obviously, not true for 2020. Just another point I want to make, unless John has already made one, but I think one that's really important is to try and fight for this C7 meeting to be as early as possible. And especially, I think, with was very helpfully explained that the schedule is not yet written in stone and we don't know when the Sherpa meetings are being held. It's all the more good for us to get in our voice before, like it has happened in Germany a week before the summit. Well, then 95% of the leaders' declaration is drafted, and I've often and bitterly complained to the Chancellery and say, you know, you call this a consultation, but you consult us when basically the wedding cake is bought, the rings are there, and then you say, okay, maybe you can choose one tune to dance with, or here are the laces of the shoe, the groom's shoes you can choose. Not very useful. So I think if we can get this message in early, that we say we would like this consultation when it happens, and we think the C7 is a consultation, have it early, have it April. I know it puts pressure on us, but this is when our messages still can have a difference, I think, at least when it comes to agreeing on the substance of policies. Thank you very much.
I think that's a very important point. When it is late, and it often is, we lose any sort of input. Kit, has there been any discussion with the government as to when they're going to endorse or allow or support a G7 summit, C7 summit, civil society summit?
You mean in terms of like they're planning on co-organizing one? They said it was probably going to be a hybrid summit, kind of around March or April, was what we were hearing. But you know, that's probably going to be quite centrally organized, and I think, as far as I understand, like the W7 are also having similar issues with sort of how the summit's going to be organized. So there are things that we're following up on there, but yeah, it's still really unclear, to be honest, but that was sort of the dates that we're working with, was as early as possible, probably March for the C7.
Right, okay.
Awesome, thank you very much.
Very good points. Okay, other points people have?
Yeah, it's Kel here. I mean, I think one thing that, Jessica Points brought this up very well, and I think there's a step that we need to take a look at, and probably should have done this, and apologies, but I think each working group perhaps do this, and also the broad task force is a power analysis and looking at the UK government and exactly where the points of change are. We're hearing it's not coming from the advisors, we're hearing it's, possibly based in 10 Downing Street, and just getting that analysis will help us judge where we should use, what meetings we should use, and what timing we should use to make sure we're targeting the right decision makers. And that power analysis probably should happen, which is not on the agenda for today. We could perhaps fit it in if people feel that should happen, but should happen perhaps in working groups and coming up with a strong idea, driven and guided by our UK colleagues on how that works and what are the pinch points for making decisions in the UK.
And just to make a positive statement, when people are scrambling, that's when they might be looking at who has to say something. This could work also in our advantage if we get our messages in early enough, and also with a good old trick already saying, hey, I have if you want, I have a little wording here that you could just copy paste. Just when things are not very well planned out, when they are last minute decisions, that this is where we might slip in a little bit of our messaging. Thank you.
Good.
And also just raising my hand one more time, what we would normally do if we're having a physical meeting, and we've done this since 2016, is we would have had this meeting in January alongside the first Sherpa meeting and look to have a roundtable. And that was a very effective way of sharing early on, as we were talking about in our timeline, policy documents and policy priorities from the different working groups on the issues to the Sherpas and having that policy engagement, which is different from the C7, because the C7 is policy, there's no doubt about that, but it's also kind of positioning, because you usually have either senior ministers or the Prime Minister or President in the room. So there's a lot about positioning and using the media and what have you, whereas the Sherpa meeting was really about getting policy across. So we're not having that this year. I mean, in an ideal world, and maybe working with Kit and colleagues, we can organize a roundtable virtually on Zoom with the Sherpas. I'm not entirely sure if the UK government will be that keen. So we have to figure that out. And also, going to Jessica's point, is the Sherpas quite the right people to be targeting in terms of policy? And we're going to come to that. And just for people in the chat, we will be coming to our campaigns and sharing the big campaign moments and timing in the next session. So hold on your fire, and we're going to come to that, talking about what are the visuals and campaigning messages and organizations happening. So I'll end there.
Okay, Eddie, you want to speak?
Yeah, just very quickly to build a bit on Kel's comment about the difference between the technical or policy work that we do and the C7 and the importance of the C7. I think that is also one part of our work that makes it a little bit more complex, but also more wholesome. And so. And I definitely agree with Jessica. I think the guidance on how we approach our messages and outside communications comes from the UK, and they have to be the ones that, because they're on the ground, they tell us actually what is happening and how the G7 presidency is inconsistent at the domestic level. And so that also tells me that we might need to be a little bit more creative. And I'm thinking back about the French G7 presidency, where the French government decided to organize their own C7 summit in the Elysee, and it was not a C7 summit; it was a civil society gathering with the presidency, just to tokenize civil society organizations, and that worked well for them in the context of getting media in the room and announcing some priorities. But the C7 had to reorganize, and they organized a press release. They organized, a moment with the journalist. They organized also an alternative summit, and that created an alternative narrative. And so I think it will be important maybe to reflect on those lessons and see how we could apply them in the future. And maybe our role there is to support whatever the UK groups tell us they need from us, and how we can put pressure on our own countries.
Good. Violaine wants to speak.
Yes, thank you. Very quickly, I really like the points made on basically trying to be there when, I think Marvin said that, when, for example, the Sherpa needs a little wording, or the point made by Eddie as well, and wondering, because it's true that usually the group in January shares the very substantial policy briefs on each of the issues, but I've had a sense in the past from speaking with some of the, at least on the health side, health experts, that we basically arrive with the, I don't know, 40, 50 pager at the stage when they are at the list of issues, the one pager. The sort of right after the priorities, the next step is to have a slightly longer list of issues where for each of the main priorities, they have a couple of points, like 5, 6 points for each. And we arrive at this stage with a very long text. So wondering if we can try to take into account, I mean, to maximize our effectiveness, what do they need at each point in time to offer something that they are most likely to use at this precise point in time. And again, around April, indeed, I mean, March, April, they are usually at really strong drafting stage. And this is when they could use, as Marvin said, a little wording. So just thought I would add that. Thanks.
Good points. Good points. Okay. Okay, other thoughts people have? One of the things I wanted to ask, if people thought it would be useful to push for the C7 meeting, the official one, and maybe the other ones, also W7, if we wanted to try and get our Sherpa team in each country to raise it during this Sherpa tour that the UK is going to do. It's not going to be high in their priority, but if, say, the US, the new US Sherpa under Biden would endorse that or suggest it, it might make it easier for, more likely that the UK government would agree. Does that make sense to people, to try and get our own Sherpa team to support it before the Sherpa tour, whatever they're going to have, which may well be virtual?
Kel here. Yeah, no, I was about to make that very same point, John. The other Sherpas do have influence, and so Canadians, for example, are very proud, as we heard from Peter on our first session, with their engaging civil society. So they can push and encourage the UK government to do the same. And I think we could do that. I think the French were pleased with their engagement as well. So I think, yes, so it's not, well, the UK government will set the final one. They can be influenced by their Sherpas, and that's our job, to influence those Sherpas to influence the UK government. So I think we should think about that.
So just to clarify Jessica's question, we're talking about pressing the UK government to schedule and support the W7 and C7 meetings early in the process. And by doing that, addressing each of the G7 Sherpas in our own countries to raise that during the UK Sherpa roundtable, they're touching base with the other Sherpas in the beginning, that we understand they'll do.
Okay, John, just on the W7, at the moment, we're not having a problem with Cabinet Office about timing. So if we do have a problem, if we can come back to you, that would be great. But I'd want to kind of hold off your political capital and don't use it on something that at the moment it isn't a problem.
Very good point. Very good point. Yes, you would know much better than we would. And it's true with any of the other meetings we're going to try and have. If people know that there are already ones that the UK government is already planning to do, it would be good to know. We don't want to push on an open door or use up chits that we want to use for later on. So does anybody know of other subgroups that have contact with the UK government that think they're going to be able to get meetings? Environment, health, any of the others?
I don't think there's anyone here at the moment from the L7, but I know that the L7 is also pursuing it, but they're way off agreeing a date yet.
Right. And the L7 has a lot more power than we do, given the size of them. So, okay, other thoughts people have before we move on?
John, what would be great is if we could leave it that if we as the W7 and presumably the other sevens are having a problem on anything, not just on the dates, it would be great if we could come back to a central point and say, can you encourage your Sherpas to back us up on X, Y, or Z? That would be brilliant.
I think that makes sense. Cal, that makes sense?
Yeah, and that's our role. So definitely. Okay.
Okay, well, until we get a firmer dates from the UK government, I think we've got about as much as we can put together at this point.
Yeah, and I just before we go, because we're getting some time back, which is great, and we're gonna have another break in a second. But I just want to share with you, if I can figure out how to do that. I'm very new to just on the calendar that I put together, and it'd be great, as I say, if we can. It's very simple in the moment, but we can build it together. This is on the Google Docs, the live document. So the link, and perhaps Joe or Ope, you can throw it back into the chat. But here is sort of, G7 specific global regional meetings that we know are happening, looking down our issues, what we think, climate adaptation summit, for example, and the World Bank IMF spring meetings for the economic recovery. Looking down in Canada, we know, for example, in Canada, sometime in 2021, likely there's going to be an election. In Japan, there's a possible election perhaps at the end of the year. We definitely know that the October 2021 we have German election. So how that will influence their thinking and their planning and what they position themselves on. And then organizations. And ideally, this is when we go into our campaigning conversations next. We can say, UK group doing this, or, climate groups are doing that. And we can add, or individual organizations, say the children's planning this. We can throw that in there, and this can become a perhaps a little big and unwieldy, but nevertheless a good central place to capture what is going on. So again, encourage everyone to add stuff there. Let's keep this live document. I'll keep circulating around the task force, but let's keep adding to this, and we can have a central place where we can see some stuff from that. So that's out there. Want to make your attention to that. The links are in your chat box now.
Okay, any final points people want to raise who haven't been able to speak? Okay, Kel, it's all yours.
Okay, and just say, for those who are new, there's no bad questions, so please feel free to add. There's an open, relaxed group, so please, if you want to share some stuff or ask some questions, go for it.
Kel, it's Tara here. I'm a little bit new, but I have a question actually about the term Sherpa. I'm kind of just joining it, and I'm kind of shocked by the use of the term Sherpa, as it is a nationality of a people and an indigenous culture, and I actually have been finding it very jarring, and I don't know the history behind why that term is used, and I understand it's pretty ensconced within the G7 and the G20, and I don't in this time. I don't know. So I just wanted to ask, I don't know where this has come from, or if there's any information on that.
So it's a good point, just for a bit of history. So it came in the 50s when EU governments were meeting. They would have their point person, of the president or prime minister, who would do all the hard work of making negotiations and carrying the things to the summit, the actual leaders meeting. So the summit hard work, the Sherpa came from that. And yes, you're right. It's a terrible reference to indigenous culture in Nepal that do amazing work, which is not nearly as easy as being a Sherpa in our context we're using here. But it's ensconced, and it's language that we would not be able to get away from. I mean, we could work to do that over a period of time, but not going to happen in the shorter term. And just a bit of further terminology, you have the Sherpa, and then you have sous Sherpas, which work underneath the Sherpa that work on different tracks, so finance and development. And then below that you have yaks. I'm not entirely sure what the yaks do, but basically they're another level of bureaucracy and government's interconnectedness that goes on within the G7 summit process. So it's not just the G7s, G20, and also EU meetings. There are Sherpa events, and so it's ensconced. And I run the Sherpa Times, and I have had a couple of emails from colleagues explaining that the misuse of the word. But we're kind of, it's ensconced, so we're going to go with it unless we want to change it, which is what we're here for. If we want to campaign and change the names, we can do so. But we're going to continue using that language while it's relevant and used with the Sherpas, if that's okay.
Oh yeah, I understand that why we're using it, because it's ensconced, but perhaps, and just because we're civil society and sometimes change comes from us, it wouldn't be a worse thing to put it as part of our notes or a part of our talking points to be something brought up, and perhaps something that we could bring forward as something for the leadership to think about changing, because in this day and age, I think this is wholly and inappropriate. So like I understand that why we're using it, and I totally get that, but I just think change may need to come from us, not from above, if you will. Thanks.
Any other comments on that?
Sorry, this is Eddie. I think that's a wonderful idea, actually, and I think that we, in a world where lots of campaigns around Black Lives Matters and systemic racism, and the way in which we use language to diminish groups and communities, this is a wonderful time to question the term Sherpa. And we have great organizations here who could lead us into that work. I'm thinking about Amnesty, and of course, if that conversation needs to happen, I do see this as an opportunity to reach out to media that would be interested into challenging the norms within very conservative institutions such as the G7.
That's an interesting way. I like the media link there, because I can get a bit of attention to that. By the way, just the Sherpas hate attention because they see themselves as behind the scenes and they don't want to overshadow the leaders and all that stuff. So they don't like attention. So it does actually create a bit of awareness with the Sherpa teams. I do think if we want to do that, we should come up with a proposal, an alternative set of names for Sherpa, Sous Sherpa, and Yaks, and we can think that through. Camels. But let's think that through, and maybe we can capture that, and that could be a distinct line of work that we put in the opening chapeau of our policy documents, with the reason why we don't think this is appropriate anymore, and alternative names suggestions, and use that with the media. I think that's an interesting and kind of fun way of raising these issues and tackling an important consideration. Thanks for raising that, Tara. Any other questions before we break? Okay, so we're going to break. We're going to come back. I'm going to switch things around slightly. We're going to go straight into campaigns and initiatives, because I feel people are champing at the bit to get into that discussion, which we sort of touched on there.
Clear more again. There will be only one Sherpa for the UK, the host country presidency, or it will be Sherpa for all 7 countries?
Each country has their own Sherpa. So each Sherpa is the point person for their prime minister or president. So Canada has a Sherpa, US, blah, blah, blah. So there's 8 Sherpas, because the EU have one as well. Don't forget the EU. The EU is actually, it's a G7, but there is 8 representatives there at the meeting. So we're gonna take a break there. Everyone can go and come back to us. Let's give a 7 minutes break, if that's okay. Come back on the hour, which is 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, or 2 p.m. UK time, 3 p.m. European time. I'll stay on here. If anybody has any more questions about Sherpas and the way the G7 works and more of that fundamental basics on their background, give me a shout. I'll stay on. I'm going to rush off 2 seconds to get a coffee. But otherwise, meet back here on the hour in 7 minutes.
Good. Thanks, everybody.
It's Kathy in Canada. Sorry.
Hey.
It's just a comment about the Sherpas. Like, I can see that it's a very difficult subject. I'm just wondering, has there ever been a complaint from the actual Sherpas? Like, I hope I'm saying this right, but the real people, the Sherpas in the Himalayas, and has there ever been a complaint? And is there a way to know if they're irked by it? Or I just was wondering, that's all.
Yeah, as I said, I don't know if the Sherpas themselves have received that. I don't have that information, but as I say, because I run the Sherpa Times, I have had an email raising that as an issue from a group, and I can't remember, this was literally like 7 years ago on that, and I can't remember where the group was from or where they came from, but they said they worked with Sherpas. So yes, so we have had, though I don't know the Sherpa community itself has had raised that. I don't know how they're organized as a group.
Yeah, of course.
But yeah, it is an interesting question. I think,
Yeah, so
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering if obviously there's no point person to go to, so it makes it very difficult to know the process to, understand their feelings and intentions on, they don't even know it's happening, or if they do know it's happening but don't know where to go with us. And anyways, just putting it out there that
Yeah, no, it's a very good point.
might be some sort of process.
As part of our outreach, we should look to contact and get those opinions. That would make sense. If you're doing outreach, on behalf of somebody who, as we know, we need to include their discussions.
Thank you.
Hi, yeah, it's Anne from Amnesty here. Just on this, I could, because I was talking to somebody, the head of our gender, sexuality, and identity program last week, and she was asking similar sorts of questions. But I have another colleague who works a lot with Indigenous people, so I could have a conversation with him and just see if he has any contacts or thoughts about this as well, and then report back. Thanks.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great, Anne. If you can do that, that would give us a bit of concrete information to
yeah,
the conversations.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I was doing some work in Bangladesh and cultural mismatches, and just speaking with somebody from Bangladesh really helped smooth the way forward. I mean, just trying, there was just even to have a guide for somebody to help us understand it better would be awesome. Like who to talk to and what it would be. Thank you so much for.
That's good point. Any other questions on the G7, how it operates, how it works?
Cal, just a quick question from me actually, on the process of these different meetings in the UK. We're still basically waiting for January to have a firm indication from the government where it will actually set out its priorities. But we're expecting the first meeting with the UK Sherpa to be in January. Is that correct?
Yes, that's tradition when they had the first one. The UK presidency starts the 1st of January, if we've heard, and that's when they can officially go public with their agenda. Otherwise, it's seen as undiplomatic, sort of talking about your G7 during someone else's G7. So the first Sherpa meeting, usually second, third week of January. One of our ambitions will be to lock down those dates, find out from our contacts those dates, and start planning accordingly.
Okay.
You quit. So I just captured that G7 Sherpa naming action. I put it in our possible joint advocacy actions on sheet number 11. So we have one raw. Okay, I am going to sign off for a couple seconds and get myself a coffee and come back in 2 minutes. Well, Sheriff, I think you're not muted, which is fine, but we can hear you typing, just in case. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. I just wanted you to know that, just in case you. Right, everyone. It's the hours, 1 minute past the hour. I think everybody's timing's slightly off in terms of terms of things. Oh, where's my video? Well, let's kick off. We're going to look now, as I said, we're going to switch things around a little bit. We're going to move the overview and to joint actions. That was just to fit in with some timing of individuals, but that person can't make the meeting. So we're going to go straight into campaigns and initiatives. The ambition here really is to start collecting and hearing what people are planning, what they're thinking of, what are sort of this big campaign we're hearing about in the UK. Is there particular campaigns around single issues that we know? We're going to capture those on the Jamboard as per usual. And then what I'm going to do, again, on Google Drive is create another sheet, not dissimilar to the calendar, but this one just looks at sort of, what are the initiatives of different organizations, and then we'll just put them in the climate, Build Back Better, COVID, gender, and whatever those columns are, so we can actually then see what people are doing across the issues and get an idea of where the energy is, and helping, again, create connections, create energy momentum, get people to join in and maybe say, oh, that's an insurance campaign that could fit in here, and having those dialogues and discussions. The task force itself is a space for convening, a space for exploring joint actions, a space for connecting groups to do sub-actions and what have you. So that's the ambition here, and that's done through sharing information and collecting it and transparency. So who wants to kick us off with an idea of what they're planning to, what they're thinking of, ideally from UK groups, because you're lead for next year, but also any other groups. And who wants to kick us off? I feel like an auctioneer. Right. Anybody? I know the UK has something planned.
I can start, Kel, if that's helpful.
Please do.
And I'd really welcome if Mariana or anyone else wants to add to what I've said. So I'm Ben Margolis. I am with the Climate Coalition in the UK part-time, and also working with Bridging Ventures internationally part-time. Really quick overview of what's being discussed in the UK, although it's still quite embryonic. I think it was referred to as the kind of next Make Poverty History. I think the first thing to say is it's not that, I don't think, at the moment. The intention isn't to have a sort of single branded campaign that all organizations are encouraged to become part of. It's more a conversation about how civil society across different issues can come together in the strongest possible way next year, recognizing it's a critical year for the UK for so many reasons, but partly as hosts of the G7 and the COP. And really those conversations are quite embryonic, and there have been working groups looking at shared organizing and how we really do a lot more local organizing, particularly in key constituencies, mobilization plans, which I'll come on to, policy and politics, and at communication. So there's a willingness, and I think there's been about 35 to 40 organizations involved in some way or other. And there's definitely a willingness to look at how we can be more coordinated, but I don't get the sense it's going to come together, or that there's the ambition to come together as a big overarching all singing, all dancing culture campaign. In terms of the plans for mobilizations, there's a live discussion, I think, about when when would be the most strategic moment to bring together a massive coordinated mobilization in the UK? And do we have the capacity to do more than one? So the conversations I've been in, and others might have been in different conversations, the sense is that we also have major local elections at the beginning of May. So probably shortly after those, late May, early June, depending when the G7 is, to have some sort of mobilization that is more focused on sort of activists and key supporters of our organizations coming out, quite political, possibly some sort of mass lobby. And then going into the summer and late summer into September, some sort of big climate festival, which is more aimed at a mainstream audience, people who would not define themselves as activists, to start the kind of countdown to COP and putting pressure on the UK government as host of the COP. There are all sorts of other plans. There's a big set of concerts planned in April. There's all sorts of other things dotted throughout that time. But I think as kind of big coherent expressions of civil society, those are the two key moments, and conversations about both of them are at a stage where it'd be great if there's people not already involved who would like to be, to get more involved in those. I can see Mariana's got a hand up, and it'd be great for her to add to that.
Yeah, great, Ben. Thank you. Yeah, I think you've made a good description of what has been discussed at the moment. And the key question is if the G7 is really going to be a bit of a test case for how the UK will bring some kind of climate leadership in the run up to the COP, how that is a strategic moment for a number of groups working on climate, but also more widely with the on the recovery agenda linked with the other issues that will also be addressed. So I think that there will be multiple efforts and a different mobilizing moment linking with the recovery agenda, from thinking also about from IMF World Bank annuals earlier this springs in April through the second half of the year, or with the annuals as well. So I think there is the wider discussion within those key crowded moments for our international processes. To what extent the putting the eggs on the G7 basket will work well vis-a-vis other moments.
And just to top and tail that, thank you, Mariana. There will obviously be a major mobilization at the COP, and that's being led by a group called the COP26 Coalition that we're all involved with and supporting. I think one of the challenges, and this was sort of came up in the chat earlier, one of the challenges it's important to be aware of is, whilst the UK government is making what some people would consider some good noises on the climate, that is masking a lot of terrible noises they're making more quietly. It's also masking a real lack of progress on the nature agenda, and the fact that after we've seen the DFIDs being amalgamated into the Foreign Office, and now this briefing that they might be reducing the UK aid budget, I think it's going to be a real challenge for civil society to really work out what its narrative is for next year, because some groups really want to push on the ambition that is being shown in some areas on the climate. For example, we've just had the commitment to ice phase out by 2030, whilst many others want to flag that really the UK government is not meeting our requirements in so many different areas. So I think that's going to be one of the challenges that we're going to face right throughout next year.
Oh, you're muted.
You're muted, Cal.
Okay, sorry, big pardon. So I'm just going to repeat this back to you just so we have this clear, and I've captured some sticky notes. So we have a UK coalition of 30 to 40 groups that are working together to build some sort of joint mobilization and collaboration, not make poverty history 2, but nevertheless get some activities and some attention to the G7 and the other events that UK is hosting in 2021. They have working groups that are going to focus on bringing the local groups in and making this a real grassroots organization. Do some events around the local UK elections will happen in May, which is just good timing before the G7. And then roll out other events in the lead up to COP26. We have the COP26 coalition that's going to plan a major mobilization in late 2021 around the COP meeting in November in Glasgow. But we also understand there's going to be a big concert in April. That I presume is going to be Global Citizen. I'm guessing they're the concert people.
No, it's a group called Climate Live, but Global Citizen are hopefully going to be involved.
Oh, okay. Brilliant. Okay, so, and then we understand, I'm just going to make a note of this, that finding a joint narrative for 2021 is really a challenge because there's different ways of engaging the government, whether or not to, push and applaud, but deliver, or actually take more of a counter narrative because there's concerns that they're going in the wrong direction. So that's going to be a challenge. That's really helpful.
Sorry, Ken, we had one thing which is really important, which is that there is also the Build Back Better coalition, which has spun out of Green New Deal UK and is probably going to spin back into the push for a Green New Deal in the UK, which is a really broad coalition of civil society organisations, trade unions, youth networks, and all sorts of others. And they're currently working out their plans for next year. And this is all being done in close collaboration, but I think they're another really important group for us to be in contact with as well.
Okay, I'm just making note of that. Working on a campaign. Then I'll say linked to, and what's the name of the coalition that you just explained that's doing some of the mobilizations? Did it have a name yet, Ben?
It doesn't have a name yet, no.
Unnamed coalition. Okay. Brilliant, thanks for that. I have some spelling mistakes, I'll correct later. Do take a look at page 9 of the Jamboard just to make sure to share any more news events, or correct or add or amend my sticky notes if I haven't captured what you said well. So I think a question for us, and I want to share with other groups and hear some more from other groups what they're planning in around G7 and other events. But I think a key issue for us is to take a look at, if we have this work happening in the UK, how can we reflect some parts of it into the other G7 countries? And what does that look like, and what could that look like? Obviously, the host country does the big mobilizations, and you're never going to replicate that entirely, because having a G7 in your country creates media interest in dynamics that you don't have at home. But nevertheless, your president or your prime minister is going to be getting on a plane, hopefully, or a summit virtually. And that gets a moment to raising these issues within your media and mobilizing groups. So I think a way for us working forward, Ben and other colleagues, is how do we take strands that you guys are doing and bring that to different countries around the G7, and also the outreach countries and countries that are invited to the G7 beyond the usual. So on that note, any other key campaigns that our people are planning?
Kathy Orlando, Citizens Climate Lobby.
Hi, Kathy.
In Canada, next week, we anticipate about 40 to 50 MPs will be contacted with regards to climate issues by our volunteers. We've been lobbying Parliament for 10 years. We've had over 1,000 meetings with parliamentarians, so they definitely will get a little bit of education about, the importance of 2021. To bring to their MPs. We're specifically focused on carbon pricing, but more importantly, we see the complexities in the livable world being the end goal. In early December, CCL USA their volunteers will also be lobbying. They've been around for 13 years, and they cover almost every congressional district, and they too will be pushing for climate action. Again, it's a working with, but they have really relationships there. And lastly, we are in 60 countries, including Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, and we will, and our goal in 2021 is to help our volunteers in these 60 countries bring to their government the most culturally appropriate carbon pricing plans and climate plans for their countries in the lead up to the COP in November. And lastly, we are going to have an open letter that will take what we're learning here and for the G7, G20 leaders, and have our members across the planet, and there's almost 200,000 of them in 60 countries, sign on to it. So taking and not just looking at carbon pricing, it's so much more than that. We see the complexities. And the more complex we are and thoughtful about it, I think the stronger we are. So we do focus lobbying on carbon pricing, but we are supportive of anything that moves forward for a livable world.
If I may, I'd like to add on to what Kathy was saying, just by also addressing the fact that we in the US will also be having a conference and lobby day in December where we will be meeting with every congressional and Senate office in the US.
So this is James from CCL in Europe, but also the UK. We're conscious with the Biden administration coming in that there is already a bipartisan bill in the House on the same subject that Kathy is talking about. And in particular, California, where Harris is a senator, have already endorsed this too. So given the UK's ambition to realign with Biden, specifically given some of the public embarrassment over their attempts to connect with Trump, even in the acknowledging of the Biden transition, we would be hopeful that this might be something that might catch the interest of UK politicians as a way of rebuilding and doing something more transatlantic than the European focus they're moving away from at the moment with trading systems. So we can see other potential points of alignment within the G7 for what we might hope to get the UK politicians to put on their priority list.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you for that. That's really useful and very helpful, and exactly the sort of information we're looking, because I can see some of the dynamics and on the different issues that are happening. I'm just going to share one that someone shared with me, and who was not on this meeting but asked to be shared, is that the BBC has a foundation or a charity arm or something that are looking to get the G7 to agree an international fund for public interest media. They've already engaged the UK government at ministerial level and other donors and ministers, and they are looking to establish a fund of at least 60 million, probably not less than 100 million, aimed at doubling the current 0.2% of development assistance currently going to media support in the global south, as well as securing substantial funding from other technology companies. And this really is to focus on low-income countries facing extinction of media freedoms, lack of investment in the media, and the etc. And I can share this with the group, but that's basically BBC Media Action is behind this, and they're looking at developing that as a fund and be part of their campaign. That's a very specific issue, but nevertheless one that is going to be pushed, and the BBC is behind it. Presumably that will get some attention. So I'll add that to one of the campaigns as a /policy campaign, but nevertheless a campaign. There we go. There's another one. And I will share that with the group, to the task force separately by email to answer your question, Erica. Any other big campaigns or any more focused on some issues there that we know are happening? And we don't have to restrict this to G7. We're hearing a lot about COP. I mean, if people doing stuff on CHOGM, that'd be good to know. If people are doing stuff on the generational meetings that are happening in Mexico and Paris and stuff like that, would be good to hear. Katie?
Yeah, thanks, Cal. So WaterAid's doing a lot of work on hand hygiene, hand washing in the context of the COVID pandemic, but also as a contributor to a broader resilience agenda that kind of connects health and climate. So one of the first things we're doing in the context of G7 is to do a little 2-pager that we'll try to pitch to the UK government, maybe along with UNICEF, maybe in the next few weeks, really, depending how quickly we can get it. And that's mainly kind of to feel out sort of whether the UK's kind of pride in their leadership on water, sanitation, and hygiene, and focus on sort of pandemic preparedness and resilience, whether they're interested in having a more specific hygiene angle to that. And that will also help us determine kind of how much stock to put in G7. We're obviously really focusing a lot on COP, but still trying to figure out what the links are between the two, and whether this kind of hygiene pitch and there's an initiative that UNICEF and WHO are leading on hand hygiene for all, whether that's something that potentially the UK would consider championing as part of their G7 agenda. So more of a sort of feeling things out for now, but that's definitely what we'll be focusing on through COP, through CHAGM, putting this kind of WASH as a contributor to resilience, to economic recovery, and pandemic preparedness on the agenda. Thanks.
Thanks for that. I put a sticky note. So Katie, just take a look at the sticky notes, make sure I got that right, if you don't mind. That's really useful. Thanks for that. Any other campaign sharing stuff? Any other initiatives?
Hi, this is Sartaj from the Global Partnership for Education.
Hi.
Just wanted to quickly share, obviously, that the GP replenishment will also be co-hosted by the UK, and we obviously have a campaign around our replenishment called the Raise Your Hand campaign. We will be working very closely with the UK government, also around the G7, because it will obviously be such an important stepping stone towards the GP replenishment. The only other thing that I'd say is the Generation Equality Forum, and this is not just GPE. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so I just wanted to say around the Generation Equality Forum that there has been some mobilization within the education sector, and we've actually been using the G7 Education Advocacy Working Group, Google group, as a way to sort of mobilize action on girls' education, because we know that girls' education is not a strong feature in the Generation Equality Forum, even though we've heard positive indications from the French and from UN Women that it is going to be considered as a key issue. So we've prepared some recommendations. So I think there's going to be some continued advocacy work from that education grouping also on the Generation Equality Forum. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you. This is great stuff, everyone. And if you don't feel comfortable in sharing online, just add a sticky note. That's great. So please just keep on putting that there. So we know there's going to be a big UK mobilization. We don't quite know what it looks like, but it seems to be getting some momentum. We know it's going to focus on G7 as well as COP. There's definitely stuff happening in COP. There's going to be a concert. So there's a lot of mobilization happening in the UK, which will get some attention. And again, we had those individual stuff that we have going on around the issues we've heard today. Anything else that people know of that's happening that can be shared?
Hi, Kel. It's Barry Johnston here. If I can go now. So I'm here on behalf of the Centre for Disaster Protection. It's a UK body set up by UK government and is now independent. And they're looking at next year as an important year for a conversation about better management of risk, better preparation for risk, better financing of risk. So it's a kind of a humanitarian reform piece as well as a bridge between humanitarian and development. So they're looking at a proposal for a G7 plus global crisis risk initiative, which would sit across the kind of increasing risk threats of climate, food security, and health and pandemics, and have a request to the G7 to lead on that, potentially host some kind of an event in the margins of the presidency building up to COP. So it bridges across from G7 to COP. So we've put a note into FCDO and Cabinet Office and out to other G7 capitals for a first round of conversations. There's interest. People are much more alive to these issues since COVID. And also that idea of tying it as a kind of a unifying thread across some of the big mobilizations around food, around climate, and around health that we know are going to come. The center is going to set up a forum or a piece of consultative research to seek input into what more specific asks would look like, but the kind of overall aims would be a new way of bringing together existing risk tracking, linking that to better pre-financing, and identifying some countries which are at unique levels of risk to perhaps bring them into some kind of a partnership that the G7 could help to get off the ground. Talks already with some colleagues, I don't know if they're on the phone, at IRC and IFRC, but we'll be sharing a note on that and inviting others to contribute. We've also briefed it into Climate Coalition in the UK via Neil Thorns and a couple of other UK NGO sectors, and looking to see if it could be taken up as part of the wider package of asks by the sector there as well. So that's ticking along behind the scenes at the moment.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Barry. Appreciate that. There's a question in chat from Ben just wanted to know how much people are hearing around the idea of a D10. For those who haven't heard of it, is that we know with the new Biden administration that they will be promoting democracy and a collection of democracies and a league of democracies even as part of, I think, their sort of push to go back to multilateralism, but come from a very distinctly Western democracies approach, perhaps to help with their tackling of China. So one of the things we've heard that the G7 may turn into a D7, a democracy 10, sorry, D10, and include the countries of India, South Korea, and Australia. This is just rumor and speculation, but is anybody, and it's been asked, is this getting any traction with the UK government? Have people heard about that? Is there anything live to this discussion, or is that just hearsay and nothing concrete as yet? Just anybody have any information on that?
Hi, Claudia from UNICEF UK. Ben, probably similarly to you, I heard a lot of whisperings about the D10 a while ago. I'd say maybe in kind of like August time. And since then, it's not come up again in conversations that we've had with Cabinet Office or others. I think that I wouldn't rule it out. And I think that it's more due to the fact that Cabinet Office is still kind of getting themselves together on the G7 and still, I know, very much in the live process of recruiting members to the team and getting their agenda out and live. But I've not heard as much rumbling about it that I was hearing in August. But yeah. That's a really unhelpful, vague answer, but basically I would say it remains a kind of rumor or rumbling, but it hasn't been as significant that I've heard lately.
Thanks for that, Claudia. Anybody hear anything else? Anything similar or different? I definitely think this is something we need to keep an eye on because it's an important development if it does happen. And I think we'll probably hear more as the Biden transition team rolls its plans out. And we had heard, this was shared in the first plenary meeting, but we had heard there's a possible, and one of the Sherpa teams of the G7s included in their scenario planning for their leader is that Biden comes and asks the UK if he could hold a very short G7 summit when he takes office sometime, presumably at the end of January, to touch on democracy. Again, that's purely speculative, but something we should keep in the back of the mind, because if that does come up, it'd be an ideal moment for us to get some strong messages in that, and we can, democracy being a key issue and all the issues that are related to that are fit much within our agenda. So something to keep an eye on and track. I see we've got some hands up. I'm going to take Kathy, then Sirtaj, and then Jenny. So Kathy?
Apologies, I forgot to turn down my hand.
No problem. Anybody? So there's some hands there. Sorry, Jenny, is that still active?
Yeah, hi, thank you. Sorry, I feel like I'm just going to repeat myself on what I said at the first plenary meeting, but we'll be working on ACT-A and global fund financing in light of COVID, and thinking about sorry, I should have put it on the timeline, but thinking about other related events next year, there will potentially be a UN high-level meeting on ending AIDS by 2030. So if there is, then we'll likely try and, have joined up messaging to the UK government about the leadership we want them to show at that meeting, as well as the leadership we want them to take on the global HIV response and COVID financing more broadly as part of the G7. And I think we discussed before that ACT-A financing would be really, prominent ask for governments next year as we seek to finance the rolling out of new tools for therapeutics, diagnostics and vaccines.
Thanks for that. And I do think, at the ACT-A, as we understand that this is the access to COVID-19 tools accelerator, the way of getting the vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and health systems out there is going to be a big campaigning issue as these vaccines are rolled out. And I think that will be popping up quite strongly in the G7 discussions. But I think we're going to hear a lot more about that. And let's put that in our negotiation, in our discussions. Obviously, the Health Working Group will be tackling that. But if anybody has any contributions, please do share. So we're getting the Gen board populated, which is great. I will take these and move them into a spreadsheet similar to the calendar, and so we can capture all the different initiatives that are out there, and we can build on that. And that, again, as I say and keep iterating, is about transparency, providing connections, and making people aware something's happening so they can either say that's exciting and incorporate it into their issues, or just get behind it generally. So please do share that. And when I share the link, I've created that document, please do populate it. Any other, we're running fast, which is great. Always good, we can capture time back. It's never a bad thing. But any other comments or any other campaign initiatives going out there?
Cal, if I may, this is Sophie from Gaddon. I just want to bring up the point which was addressed a little earlier on, largely around being a little bit more strategic with the campaigns, especially here in the UK. I think we've obviously heard that there are a variety of different campaign ideas being floated at the moment, and the potential that, or the unlikeliness of it being a joint up coherent piece. And especially to go back to the point about how we make sure that the policy asks that we have within this space actually translate into a campaign idea, especially when we're talking about the Build Back Better discussions, the climate conversations, the ones on gender, et cetera. They're also inherently linked. But I'm just wondering, is there a way in which we can ensure that the policy asks that we're developing here are going to be an integral part of any campaign that comes out? So is there a way of trying to coordinate that? I don't know, Kit, if bond is the best way to do it, or if there is another mechanism that might be the most effective. So I just wanted to throw that question out there.
So throwing you in the spot there, Kit, or Ben, if you're still with us, on how do we make those linkages?
I was just going to come in on that particular point. I mean, bond would be one touch point, especially for the C7, but I would see us kind of working together with you at Gaddon and others as well. And I think I agree that the work being done on the policy side does need to translate into the campaign's work, and possibly vice versa. But it's important that we are all better coordinated, and it's a worry. If we were coming up with some really good asks and language at the global level through the task force and the UK level, sort of working together on the policy side, that didn't translate, and but we don't know that that's not going to happen yet. But it is something that we'd be really keen to work together on. So definitely keen to take this forward with you and with the other engagement groups.
Excellent.
I think, and Kit, I'm sort of feeling it might be useful for you and I to chat off this call about this, because I think it's not clear what the answer to that question is, to be honest, right now. Thinking about the broad scope of next year rather than specifically the G7 or the COP. And through my role at the Climate Coalition, I'm trying to hold a bit of that and have some of those conversations, but it does feel it's a little bit disconnected right now, and there's lots of different spaces, which isn't a very helpful answer, except to say on behalf, for the Climate Coalition, very keen to link and connect up more coherently as much as we can.
And that's great. And thanks for that, Ben and Kit. I mean, I think this is why we're having this conversation this early, is to start those conversations, is to start building out shared agendas and shared campaign objectives. Obviously, with civil society, as we all know, there's no concrete connections, and we can't say, don't do that and do this. That isn't how civil society works. But I think increasing the conversations, interconnectedness between the campaigns, the policy groups in the different G7 countries, we can start building momentum to the sort of the top line messages, the top 3 priorities, however we want to define that. And that will hopefully create synergies between the groups. And so we have a lot of shared agendas as we build these campaigns and we build policy papers together in consultation, and also creating ways and mechanisms sharing that information. So, obviously we cannot say this is how it's going to happen. That's not how civil society works, and certainly not how task force works. But definitely build those bridges so that this clarity and momentum comes together, and hopefully we can and land on the same page for 2021, because it's such a critical year for us as civil society. There's so much on the table that we can't be speaking with 1,000 different voices. We need to find a way of collectivizing that, while at the same time allowing those separate issues, individual issues, to happen and to take place. I mean, we don't want to stop that, but we want to have some clarion calls to governments to act. Any other comments? Initiatives?
Well, this is Pauline from Cheshire, just really quickly. Just to say that obviously we'll be supporting the girls' education agenda, and we've done a lot of work, especially in Kenya, on girls with disabilities and education, and ensuring that they can access, quality education. So yeah, we're going to be working on some resources. I wouldn't talk about a campaign, probably some policy resources around that for beginning of the year, which is also going to be, I think, great for the GP replenishment, just because it's hosted by UK and Kenya. So yeah, I mean, there is that. And then we're looking at working with the UN Girls Education Initiative and the World Bank, so I can share more information. Just to flag, we do also have a symposium with UNESCO on inclusive education next week. So if anyone wants any details on that, happy to, send the link around. That's it from me. Thanks, Carl.
Thanks, Pauline. And can you pop that in? I didn't catch that in the notes. Can you pop that into the Jamboard, because you're trying to capture that?
Will do. Thanks.
Thanks. So we're running 20 minutes early. Fantastic. One thing I think it might be worthwhile, and I just throw this out there because it's just come to me, and as we're discussing that, is it worthwhile for us to reconvene in some way, not similar to this, obviously not 4 hours, but maybe just an hour or an hour and a half, just before the holidays in December, to touch base again on where the different campaigns are, what the messages, if anything clear is coming together, and just again, pooling information and sharing that to encourage discussion. Then we can question different groups that are working on different campaigns. Do people think that would be a good idea? And if you think it's a good idea, just throw a reaction, whichever one, a heart, a laugh, maybe not laugh, but a heart, or a thumbs up or clap. If you think it'd be worthwhile for us to reconvene something similar to this, where all the different campaign groups can come, have a conversation for an hour and a half just to share this information, where they are in terms of their thinking. Okay, we're getting a fair few thumbs up. So I will work to do that and deliver that, just before the holidays. So we have lots of time for different groups to have that conversation. And then speak with perhaps you, Ben, and Kit, and the other groups that we know are working on this to come together and share that information. Cool. So it's 20 minutes to the hour. If no one has any other things to throw in, I suggest we have a break. We're going to keep going ahead with claiming this time back from your agenda. So we're going to have a 10-minute break. We're going to come back at 10 minutes to the hour. We're going to have a quick overview of advocacy campaigning, and we're going to go through what we've done in previous years to share some examples. Then we're going to break into breakout rooms, which are going to be randomly sorted, where we're going to use the Jamboard and throw up some ideas that we think could be useful for this group as a task force to do as joint advocacy to 2021. and then we'll come back, share those informations, hear next steps, and a wrap up, and then we'll end. So you have 10 minutes. Please come back at 10 minutes to the hour, which is 9:50 Eastern Central Time, 2:50 UK, and 3:50 US. And I'm sorry for me, I don't know what time it is in Tokyo, but I know it's late. Okay, thanks everyone. 10 minutes. Hey everyone, 10 to the hour, according to my clock, so let's reconvene. As I said, the ambition on this one is to, sorry, I'm opening up my agenda here. It's looking at campaign, it's looking at joint advocacy initiatives that we can do, and just kick us off, just want to review kind of what we have done in previous years. And I'm gonna ask those who've been on the working group for the task force for a while to share. I'll wait till just a couple of seconds. I see John's not back yet, so I'll just wait a couple of seconds because I know John has been quite involved in this sort of work in the past. But in the meantime, does anybody want to share any ideas that share what kind of previous history of what we've done, rather than me talking all the time? Anybody's been on the call for a while? I think everybody's still on break, actually. But anyways, I'll kick it off. So some of the stuff that we've done in the past, and hey, John, we're just sharing what we have done as a task force in the past. So just want you to chip in if you can. But for example, what we have done in the past, we've written a joint letter to the incoming presidency. We did this for Macron, we did this for Trudeau, and we could do it for Johnson, saying, kind of giving an outline to the major issues that we think, just a one-pager, major issues we think are priority. And also we tend to look at a little bit on the civil society engagement side, saying, please ensure that you have a strong and civil society engagement, C7s and with the media center and what have you. So kind of that sort of discussion and stuff, that's one thing we do, this joint letter. John, any other sort of past history of what the task force has done in terms of joint advocacy initiatives?
Well, my recollection is that we play a lot of a role in the C7 meetings that come up, or the one that we try to get organized. I mean, the most organized group across NGOs and across issues is the G7 task force. So, and at this point, interaction is pretty inactive on this issue. So it's going to be important this year because we don't have many US NGOs working on this yet.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. This C7 it's traditionally played that role way back when the C7 was originally invented. For those who want a bit of history, C7 was invented by the Russians, quite amazingly. And President Putin convened it. He paid for everybody to fly over.
Ironic, eh?
Very generous. And he came along and heard, and he was personally present at the C7s. So that kicked it off, and it's been running since that 2006 G7. Give or take every year. Obviously, in 2012, the US did not do it. 2020, the US did not do it. And the UK did not do it in 2013. But other than those two exceptions, countries, it's happened every year. And again, it's a way of bringing groups together to make that happen. So that's the thing we have done and help organize that. And we'll be working with Kit as he pulls that together. The other things we have done in the past, and again, this kind of goes back to where our power analysis comes from. During the Japanese presidency in 2009, the analysis came back that the ambassadors are actually quite influential in the decision-making process, the Japanese government at that time. So we had embassy meetings with each of the G7, Japanese embassies in each G7 countries. And I think everyone agreed that was actually quite effective in getting the Japanese government to hear our messages, quite strong messages, because the ambassadors reported that directly back to the Prime Minister. So, I mean, I think, what we're going to do now is we're going to go into a breakout rooms and sort of brainstorm some ideas around the joint initiatives. But a lot of it will be prevaricated on a power analysis, which I'm now keen to get on with, and we'll do that for our task force, perhaps by email, and I'll work with UK colleagues to do that. But where do we think the levers are for the UK government to hear strong messages from us? And that could help with the joint messaging. Again, going back to France, we understood the way President Macron worked is basically if he spoke to him directly, you got your issue. He pretty much was a hands-on, I'm going to make that happen sort of approach. So getting an audience with him was seen as key to influencing the agenda. What it sounds like 10 Downing Street, it might be very similar to that approach, given Boris Johnson's reliance on close advisors. Well, not so many nowadays, but nevertheless, close advisors and his own policy team rather than the ministries. So any other sort of people who've had experienced the G7 or other useful ways of influencing governments on the G7? just to go back on some previous ideas as well, when the G7 was slightly more, the G7 was slightly, I'm just trying to find some examples here. I'm just sort of going through my emails, which is not very good while we're talking about this. But in terms of the G7, that we did, when we had more money, we did a full page advert in the FT around the pictures of superheroes, and that was for the Japanese G7. So that was when we had lots of money and people contributed. Don't have that money this time, unfortunately. And there's also have been way back when economists, we did a dear G7, please, dear G8 at the time, please fulfill your promises. We actually did a post-it campaign, post-it note, and then we presented that to the Prime Minister. We have presented pledges to, we did petitions. We did, with working with Avaz, we did big petitions around the G7, and we presented 1 million signatures to Blair and Merkel prior to the G7 chancellorship. That was my famous occasion when I was on the stage with Merkel and there was a confusion and she thought I should do the handover, but it's definitely not me to do the handover. So slightly scared, I looked at her and said no in front of the press, and she was actually very freaked out by that because there was a strange person in her chancellery saying no to her. So it was not my finest moment of lobbying, but there you go. So we have done big petitions, we've done newspaper adverts, we've done presentations to the presidencies, the prime ministers, the presidents of those countries. We've done letters, we've done embassy visits. So we have a range of issues, obviously, depending on how much money and how much coordination that we see happening. But there's a lot of history there, and I can share some stuff with you. I'll put it on Google Docs, some examples. I would share it with my screen, but I can't find some of the examples. They're kind of fun. So that's kind of what we can look at. So what I want to do now is break us into breakout groups to actually just think through some ideas, use the Jamboard. We're all going to use the exact same Jamboard, just about post-it notes, give some ideas what we can think about it. And then while we're doing that, if people can then go and add sort of ticks, not big check marks. I think we've had this before, check marks tend to take it over. Just little lines, so we can add them up on what people think were actually the best ideas out there. So as we add them, take a look at them and just add it as a single line if you think it's a good idea and you want that to be perhaps one of the upvoted in terms of the poll of actions that we do. So we're just going to do that process. We're going to do that for 25 minutes, and then we're going to come back and review that and see what we have and see if there's anything that percolates up for us to take forward as a group to action in the next couple of months.
Cal, do you have facilitators in each one, or do we select them?
No, I think I don't think we need facilitators. It's kind of a no-brainer. We have 44 participants. We're probably going to break into 4 breakout rooms. Joe is I think, helping put that together. And at some point, she's going to press the button and we're going to disappear into those groups for 25 minutes, brainstorm ideas, throw them up there, throw some ticks on the ones that you think that are really good ideas and you want to see populate and move up the poll. And then we'll come back in 25 minutes, which is 25 past the hour, and take a look and see where we're at. So Joe, are you happy to move us into the various rooms?
Indeed, I'm just in the process.
Okay, yeah, great, thanks. So at some point we're all going to disappear. So get that Jamboards up and start adding some ideas. Hey everybody. So, because we're in break rooms, so I suggest you turn your videos on if you feel comfortable in doing so. If you don't feel comfortable, that's fine, fully understand, but we can make it a bit more interactive. So, weirdly, Todd, we have you twice because I know you do your iPad and your computer thing going on, so we have you down there twice. That's why that Tara's there twice. Cool. So, brainstorm, ideas. What should we do?
I just joined from my last meeting, so I'm playing catch up now.
Okay, so actually what you missed is that we nominated you to lead on this process. So basically what we're doing here, Toko, is we're looking at joint advocacy actions that we can do as a group in 2021. We shared some previous ones was joint letters, we did together, we did petitions. So what do we think would be useful in contributing to the greater good, if you like, for 2021? And it's a free-for-all, so throw ideas in there. There can be bad ideas, there can be good ideas. And then if you like an idea, just slowly add, not a big tick, but just a little line, and we can upvote them based on that. And we're all using the same board on page 11 of the Jamboard.
Super.
I like the idea of doing some sort of media outreach, like an op-ed in particular newspapers that we know would get traction with, well, in particular with the UK government, I suppose, if it is UK focused.
Yeah, we've got a number of journalists and things like that that generally cover global development issues, and I think it might be a good idea to think about something like that, and what other voices we might want to bring in.
I also think what's key is also where it's placed as well. Like, I think given the current UK positioning, it's probably better to look for something around more right-leaning newspapers, if that is a possibility. I think you're more likely to pick up in traction with certain vocal voices in the government.
Okay, so let's play with that for a little bit. I agree with on the right-wing idea in terms of, the Guardian, they probably not top of their agenda to read, or they may not care as much. But within that,
I think they just expect it from the Guardian.
Well, indeed. So if we're looking at op-ed, so do we think perhaps a series of op-eds? Do we want to? What sort of voices do we want to be in those op-eds? Do we want our highfalutin groups to do those op-eds, or maybe do some associations between a highfalutin person who gets obviously op-eds, they want some big name, but pair it with someone from the South, or someone doing some interesting stuff around that, or maybe a series to try to do 2 or 3 honest issues. I mean, just trying to brainstorm. Anybody thoughts on that?
I like the idea of pairing it. I think that's a very nice idea. And I also think that when you look to pair it, and I don't know how easy it is for us, but if we can get people from maybe industry or the private sector as well involved, again, it might have more traction. But I mean, this is just me thinking. I'm quite happy to be told that people have other views.
Well, this is exactly what it's brainstormed for.
It would be fantastic to get feedback from the Decade of Health campaign, which has just been running in the UK, and find out what have been the findings of that as a public engagement strategy, and the messaging that were put out, what has been landing, what has not been landing. Because there's been I know it's a foundation sponsored initiative, but they've spent a lot of money on comms, media engagement, TV adverts, public billboards, which they got money for. So the focus, I think, in the UK is likely going to be something in the north of England. And so thinking about any particular comms, which is, I was going to north facing, but thinking about like what were the role of billboards and some of those things that were where they spend money on. Did they get any traction? Did they get any feedback? I really think that, and I think Ogilvy, with the PR agency, it might just be useful to just get a roundup of what traction they got with some of those.
That's great. Do we have those sort of contacts, Toko, to actually?
Yeah, we do, and we can try and arrange that.
That'd be amazing. That'd be really effective. To learn that if they're willing to share, you can chase that out.
So maybe that's something that we could do for our next meeting and see in December potentially.
Good. Okay, that's excellent.
Hi.
Hey.
One thought. In the previous session, we discussed, we were collecting all the advocacy campaigns that are planned, and we saw how many there are and on how many themes. And it's fantastic. But of course, in terms of, let's say, of having a clear message beyond the initiatives that everybody is going to be having, a sort of unifying message, is there a way for us to early on, and I put a post on that because I was reading a few minutes ago the Build Back Better 10-liner that's on the web. Is there a way for us to have a short unifying text that, I mean, it won't be possible to have every issue under it, but if it has the main things like I don't know, like maintain ODA and have climate and have all the big, at least the themes, then we can use it as a basis to sort of launch all the other actions so that it looks a bit consistent and that it's readable, let's say, as a sort of, we could have a rallying hashtag, and then when people have their individual actions, they also mention that.
Frozen on us there, Belaine, but we got what you were saying, and I think that's important. I think there's two things with that. One is I'm making a note of that because I think having the top line messages is key for clear. Hey, is everybody frozen here, or is it just me?
I think, Cal, your internet connection is dropping.
Okay, there, got me now.
We got you.
Good. So I thought Belaine, you had frozen, but it's actually me who frozen. Sorry about that. So just to say, I think that's really important. I don't think we're there yet for the shared messaging, but I agree with you. If we are going to be putting messages out there, it has to be consistent, it has to be top line, and it has to be encompassing the range and multitude of issues underneath it. We're not there yet. The ambition would be, and that's why I think we're looking to come back together in December, is if we can start collating that and building that, and that's why we're starting this early. So I agree with you, yes, we need to be there, but we're not there yet. And whether or not we'll ever be able to say to everybody, do this and only this, probably not. But if we can have a momentum, people sharing it, coalescing, that'd be cool.
I think what's going to be tricky here is that there is a special need for UK civil society to get specific things from the UK government at the moment. There's a conversation on ODA. The Prime Minister has just in the last hour given a speech where he was asked about UK's commitment to ODA and the increase in the defense budget. And his language was, I think we can be proud of ODA, but also by investing in armed services, you can do some of the greatest things for some of the poorest people in the world. This is just in the last hour. So you've got these two things, which is the UK government behaviors, engagement, ODA, and what civil society wants. And then you've got UK's wearing the G7 presidency and not just acting for itself, but also for G7, for all of those, G7 policy areas. So how do you split those up between UK priorities versus G7 priorities? And so I think the two could actually get intermingled. And I just wonder whether people are picking up those two different things.
Just one point, because I thought on the sort of, obviously we've not reached the stage, as Cal noted, of the long, like each puts their issue and then we have a 50-pager. But we need to do that, of course, like every time. But I was wondering, and to the point of Toko, today, this year is not any year. We're going to face the biggest economic turndown that probably most of us alive have known or will know. ODA are going to be automatically contracting in absolute terms, even if they are maintained in percentage terms. So for all our issues, climate change, development, everything, this is going to be a major constraint. And I was just speaking with one of the G7 governments earlier this week, and they said basically now at this stage, anything that's non-COVID in development is not going to come out. The funding is not going to be paid because they just don't have the money. So prioritization is already happening for COVID for good reasons, but with the economic downturn arriving on my side, I wonder if this is not even one, and I don't know the response, but is it one unifying message we can agree on that ODA is key and that we have to have a position about it? maybe we can agree to that before we agree on the line items of my issue, your issue, their issue.
Yeah. Good point.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, the difficult year is going to be key for us to making sure that keep what we have and make progress against the key outstanding things in 2021 is going to be the dual messages, don't turn back time and advantages. So in terms of actual actions, I mean, a couple of things. One is I'm going to write down this. I do think we should do a letter to Boris Johnson on taking over the presidency of the G7 to it's a letter from us just on points and engagement. So I'll write that one in. Do we want
a congratulations letter for taking on this role? We have confidence in your leadership to deliver this.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's usually about, we stress the importance of the crucial year, making progress, not putting back the time, and also engaging civil society roughly.
And are we thinking, so we can write that letter to number 10, or are you thinking about that letter as well being published in a local? I'm just thinking about a impact of addressing a letter to Boris Johnson directly. Absolutely. Are we thinking about that potentially could be a letter to Boris in The Spectator, for example?
Yeah, definitely. I don't see why not. Definitely. So, but let's do the letter, and then we can either sign on letter and getting that circulated globally, and then presenting it to him.
So, Kel, when did the UK government took that presidency?
1st of January.
Oh, they will take.
That's right. It's still the US's presidency, even though they haven't done much with it this year. They still are the president until the 31st of December.
Okay.
So, are we thinking any sort of? And I know this is we need to connect it with a lot of the UK groups. Don't get me wrong, but we can go and propose things. To doing a petition, to doing something starting in January. Is there something that we think we can do that would bring attention to G7, the UK presidency, and put some pressure on them in some sort of public campaigning thing, some sort of action, some petition? Those are people kind of over petitions nowadays, but something like that shows global solidarity. Anybody, any thoughts on
that? Petition, yeah. I think why it's important to put a petition on the cards, it allows alignment with some of the other movements that could be doing petitions. So putting a petition here allows some alignment on messaging, because there may be some other movements that have traction and they'll be doing something, they'll get the mileage, but then may not be aligned on messaging. So this could potentially allow us to use their forum, but have a contribution on the message.
Howard, do you want to put a post-it note to that?
Yeah, I could do that. So what I'm proposing that could we work with Global Citizen on a petition to G7, for example, or some other similar movements that they may have the legs, but where alignment of messaging could be important.
Yeah, and maybe we ask, maybe we go proposal to Global Citizen, advise, move on, 38 degrees, get up, Australia, because Australians may turn, and say, can we do a joint one for everybody? And obviously it's been kind of top line-ish with the climate, the COVID, build back to their gender, but get something out there that's could get a massive numbers that, again, it's not going to be the definitive action, but could really contribute to that work.
Yeah. Have we ever done something with, I'm going to call them first ladies before? And what is their role here? I'm thinking that Boris Johnson's partner is very influential on climate change. And this is something that she is passionate about. And a lot of the policies that we're going to be seeing coming out of number 10 on climate change, I don't think there is any doubt about where that is coming from. So I think that we should really be thinking about, particularly Carrie as a convener. She could actually like that role for her in the around G7 convening, especially if it links to COP26, and she could be somebody that we could ask whether she could facilitate around this. We could then have, alongside the G7, we could have, I don't know what you would call it, what you'd call, you know, it's not first ladies, it's not partners, it's not, I don't know what that name is, but the partners club of G7 that could, I think, be influential in some spaces.
Do you have to be a little bit careful how that's kind of perceived in the public eye and the media's eye? Because it might be seen as, I mean, what mandate do people have that are just partners of leaders? Why are they discussing issues for, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Because
I'm just a bit worried that it could look, the optics could be a bit worrying.
But I think, yeah, but they are going to be having a round table, some kind of meetings around. So they do have those meetings anyway.
I do that.
And so it may not be a public facing meeting, but it could be a round table that we could look to have around some issues of strategic importance.
Yeah, okay, let's make a post-it note of that.
A quick comment on the
ahead.
engagement of first ladies, and that was not in G7, but for example, for the African first ladies, a way to engage them in a way that was not going to be saying, well, precisely why do you speak? For example, in health was around immunization, precisely sort of like thinking of the future generations as your mothers. I mean, so that there may be ways, specific themes, and climate change is nice as well, because of course it's the future, to sort of make it credible that we ask them to have an opinion. Or
yeah, and I think, yeah, on the Africa one is an example, because our flood is something that was set up in terms of the HIV/AIDS progress, and it's been an important forum around the African Union. But I think that's a good point about, you know, what is the role? Is there a role? So should I add that on the Jamboard? I haven't been on Jamboard. I better go in.
Okay.
What slide are we working on?
We're working on page 11.
Page 11.
I think it's similar to that, and the one thing the spouses do, they do have their own, if they meet in person, they do have their own agenda, and they usually go do some outreach and what have you, and influencing that. So you could actually encourage the spouses to meet with young people talking a range of issues. You can encourage them to go and have conversations or reception on another issue, invite civil society. You know, you can play with that in situ. I mean, it doesn't really affect the outcome of the G7 because that's a separate parallel, and it's happening when the Sherpas are finishing off the declaration. But it does help. Yeah. It does help raise issues. So that's one thing. Another one I thought would be quite useful. In the first time, as far as I'm aware, the speakers met the first time. The G7 speakers convened by Nancy Pelosi. It was about the only G7 thing that happened in US in 2020. I thought it was an interesting one. I mean, obviously the speakers, I mean, in Canada, the speaker's not that particularly powerful. I think in the UK, they're not that particularly powerful. They own the agenda a little bit. We had a very active speaker, the last one, but this one's not taking that role. But in the US, they're hugely important. As we know, Nancy Pelosi can set the agenda on a lot of issues and veto things, or not veto herself, but she can make that happen. So I think engaging with that group and finding a way of having dialogue and a roundtable in the lead up to their speakers meeting, I think that'd be really an interesting way of influencing the debate, especially with the US context.
Yeah.
Any other ideas? And while we're on, can you do go to the Jamboard and because I'm with you guys, so I can start forcing you guys to do some stuff to show good examples to the other groups, is start putting little strokes beside stuff that you think is a really good idea. And I'm going to write this G7 speakers one. Any other ideas?
When you say add a little, do you just mean like a little line next to?
Yeah, like a little one. So we could add up the one. So we get, rather than a big check, which I think last time got a bit messy. Okay.
At this point, we don't actually have a view of the countries that the UK might invite, and just wondering, I imagine that India will be on the list because of climate change and because of other reasons. Rwanda and other countries might be invited there. So just wondering from an engagement perspective, what we might want to do with those countries as well.
Good idea. Just to say, someone's going crazy with the old lines there. It's kind of funny. Oh, don't wreck it. No, that was kind of cute. Like that. Yeah, let's make it so. Yeah, I think the outreach is very key. I mean, there's 2 outreaches which we know may happen, is that they might expand to the 10, include India, Australia, and South Korea. If they do that and make it part of the official process, their Sherpas will input on the agenda and communique, so they will automatically play a role in shaping the outcomes. And then you have the slightly separate group, which is the outreach group, which usually is primarily African, Latin American, and East Asian groups. They're invited, and they're invited to do a lunch, and they're invited to dialogue with the G7 Sherpas, G7 leaders. And that is less influential because they're basically turning up to have lunch and share ideas and rather than input. So there's 2 different processes. So, but I think that's a good point. And what we do here sometimes is when it's those G7 those leaders from those countries come to the table, they tend to talk on economic and business issues because they're looking at the big trading nations rather than the social economic issues. And that's always been a bit of a problem for us, because the G7 will say, well, it's not being raised by them, and we're going by their agenda. So that takes some lobbying from us to get sure that those countries are discussing that.
I was also thinking about issue sponsors and thinking about who can become critical partners for us. And that's something that we need to think about in terms of reflecting on how the UK government works. And business and private sector has been such a key focus for this government, and linked with COVID-19, building back better and things like that. So you're going to have a really big private sector and business influence. And I'm just wondering, in order to move our agenda forward, whether we want to be thinking about allies and sponsors that can work with civil society to reinforce some of those things, so that you don't have, I mean, I mentioned earlier on that civil society is going to be in such a crazy space, because on one hand, you want to be really calling out the government for ODA, what's being described, the redefinition of ODA in the UK, as demonstrated this afternoon by the links with defense. So you've got civil society that is actually angry at the moment, including an announcement today that the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office won't have any foreign nationals. It will just be UK staffers only, both in the UK and overseas. So you've got these things that really civil society is enraged by. And at the same time, you want constructive engagement. So rather than civil society going into G7 being these troublemakers, noisemakers that the government doesn't want to engage with, is it tactical to really find allies and alliances with non-civil society partners that really engage and advocate for our own issues? And we can then work on identifying who those partners would be.
And to that point, I mean, not that we should always rely on others, but Global Citizen obviously comes to mind. They are funded, I mean, by private sector and have a lot of money. I don't know if they are prioritizing G7 next year. I know that they had deprioritized G7 and G20 in the last few years because for reasons we know all, that it's been hard. Maybe it's worth trying to also, I don't know if they are on the bigger group today, but maybe it's worth knowing how much priority they are putting on it and maybe doing a bit of a case that they really prioritize it because they will have so much money.
So two things on that. One is that we understand, or I understand that the so Global Citizens is part of that group that Ben talked about, that's planning some of the bigger stuff, and I've seen them commenting on some papers. So they are looking at the G7. I also think, I'm not going to say no, but in some of those who are funded by Gates can tell me that's a bit better, but Gates are planning to get behind the G7 or the 2021 agenda quite strongly in the UK. And I believe they're behind funding some of this stuff. So yeah. Gates are turning on some money towards 2021 lobbying, and that would probably include climate as well as G7 in terms of defending aid and health, what have you. So I think there is going to be money flowing. Don't get me wrong. I think it's going to flow to particular groups and it's going to flow to particular agendas. I don't think it's going to be open to coalition or unfunded initiatives, if you like. It's going to be very focused on Gates anchor grants and stuff like that. But there will be money around. So I think that's a very good point.
So, and just to add, I mean, for sure, there will be Gates money around, but to the point of broader private sector, Global Citizen has largely reduced reliance on Gates, now has very large group of private sector. So if we think of other type of private sector that can allow to have a broader reach.
Yeah, I sit on their policy advisory board, so I'm happy to take some stuff back.
So we only have about a minute left. Pauline, I was just going to ask you, as your position at WHO, you know, is there, I mean, we know the UN agencies go to the G7 as observers, and I'm pretty sure that your boss will be there given the COVID situation. Is there any stuff that we can do with UN agencies, civil society, any joint messaging or joint events or joint sign letters or something that's going to be a partnership of unusual allies? Not unusual.
So the last few years, it's not only been WHO, but it's been WHO, Gavi, Global Fund, at least in the health sector, for G7 ministerials, for the leadership, for G7 leaders. It may happen, but it really depends on the presidency. Of course, with the US, it was going to be a no-go, therefore there was never going to be anything. And even during G20, it was challenging because US was putting a veto, and WHO itself has a sort of neutrality duty. They can't input, they can just reply to requests for technical clarifications. But I'm not sure this applies to Gavi and Global Fund, so that could be interesting. And we can have intelligence that we can share, but in an informal role. But would be definitely worth checking with Gavi Global.
Yeah, no, definitely. What I was thinking is that, you know, whether or not we can do with your ED, we can do a joint op-ed with some society groups.
Yeah.
Obviously, getting him positioning on these issues in advance of the G7. So just getting some sort of statements out there saying that this is a joint issue. And I'm presuming the UK will invite him to the meeting. So we're going to disappear off the main group now.
I have a feeling that will happen. Yeah. We're being kicked out.
We're going back to the main group. Raw.
Good to be in the same group, Amy.
See you guys. Hey everybody, so we're back. Sorry, I just gotta organize my screen. Thing went kind of crazy on me. There we go. So hopefully everybody had a good conversation. I know our group had a really good conversation. We threw a lot of things on the Jamboard. So basically, we just really want to now, in the next, say, 10 minutes, just take a look at what has come up. What do we think, if everybody can take a look at the Jamboard and just add your little strokes to what you think should be a good action, we can see if anything percolates up and we can then sort of step in our next steps, action some of that stuff. Does anybody have any comments, anything that came up that you think is really important to share with the whole group from your particular working group? Is there anything you want to share? Sorry, my dog is ripping up paper in the background. Sorry for that.
Hi, Kel. This is Raj. Just a quick point. I think that our group perhaps accidentally put its suggestions on the possible tactics and strategies as opposed to slide 11, which is possible joint advocacy actions. So yeah, just to say that when people are looking at possible actions, that they should also look at slide 10, please. Thanks.
Right, well, I just changed the title. Some of them makes it easier. So, okay, we have lots of actions, a lot of good points around that. On the second, in the page 11, at the bottom, there's 2 points to note, which I think is kind of interesting. One is, this could be background that helps us inform our actions. One is learn what has worked successfully in the UK with this government in terms of public campaigning. And there we talk about, looking at in the northern the UK government has its majority based on northern constituency, which it didn't traditionally win. So that's very influential. So is that something we can learn how to influence? And again, we iterated the importance of top line messaging. So if we are going to communicate to the public, we really not need the multitude because that doesn't communicate well, but really coming with some top line messaging that allows the rest of the messages to flourish. And then in terms of what we put under research is looking at, again, we iterate doing a power analysis of this government of what does influence it, how does it operate, and building from our UK colleagues to help us, as well as building non-civil society partnerships out there with private sector and other groups. And I'm reading one which is very small, so bear with me. Research more NGOs in each G7 countries that have the bandwidth and budget to be more involved in the G7 strategic planning. So perhaps that's something we can do in our own markets to take a look at that and feed that back into the task force. So those are sort of research and background notes. That's apart from the actions themselves. I'm just going to go through some of the ones that got a lot of ticks. So just like Build Back Better, can we develop a 10-line text that represents our top 3 level issues in G7 and have it either on Sherpa Times and use it as basis for Twitter, media, and initial letters? So that got a lot of ticks. Another one got a lot of ticks is useful to time letter to Sherpa is approximately 2 weeks before the key first meetings and take into account the stage of process. So that's good. Op-eds in newspapers in the UK, perhaps joining up prominent leaders in the north and south to create some pairings to get some stuff into the UK press. That came from our group, and just a little side note to that was perhaps target the right-wing press rather than the Guardian, go for the Daily Mail, that type of thing, because that's probably where the government's going to be looking a bit more. We saw a lot of ticks for identify key influencers of the G7, like Bill Gates and others, who can send letters to the G7 presidency and other multilateral organizations with key messages. I think that's important. We know the Gates Foundation is going to be focused on the G7 as well as wider 2021 issues. So I'm sure they have a plan for Bill, but we can help influence that. Another one got influenced by Global South Voices, influencing regional summits to make ASA G7. So making sure the African Union and other ASEAN put those issues into the G7. Networks of youth advocates from youth-led groups and messages to the official Y7 and to leaders about the commitments they have want to see at G7. So, I mean, I think that we know the Y7 is happening, and I think that's a good point. Maybe our takeaway is amplifying those messages from youth in our communication so that we're actually not just doing it within the Y7 context, but they're happening in the wider context, and we can amplify that through. Any other points raised or any of the big issues that people thought would be useful? Let me take a look at the chat here. Just going to the chat, so I haven't looked at it for a second. So I think what's coming up there is, I think a letter in some shape and form is a good idea. Doing some op-eds would be useful. Amplifying messages from other groups, and then within that context, doing a power analysis and getting some top-line messages. We had shared ideas about petitions before and stuff like that. I'm not really seeing a lot of ambition around that more public combined campaign approach for this group anyways. Obviously, it's going to happen in other forums and other coalitions we heard about earlier, but is there any appetite for that sort of thing? Our group has suggested maybe getting involved with Avaz, Move On, Get Up, 39 degrees, 39 degrees, 38 degrees in the UK, and doing a joint petition really on a broad number of issues and really give some major numbers. That was one thing, but I'm really not seeing that really emphasized or shared here. Is anybody thought about that sort of thing?
So this is James. The UK citizens have, through UK petitions, been extremely responsive to major political issues, which have not been listened to by the government in the last 2 years. As many as 6 million signing. What tends to happen when this takes place is there is massive press coverage once it becomes critical. What's interesting in Europe is Europe has its own public engagement mechanisms called European Citizens Initiatives, and these are notoriously hard to get legislation even to be considered, and the few that have been successful have been very disappointed. But I think the idea of engaging citizens directly with the G7 in this way is actually quite an interesting one. Certainly the UK public has shown that if its imagination can be captured, they will respond. Because it's G7 and linked to COP, we know that in Europe in particular, over 90% of the citizens, according to surveys, are concerned about climate. So a decent combined proposition with multiple NGOs would likely get the critical mass to start this kind of support. If we manage to pick one that did the cross-cutting across the pillars, I think this idea actually has huge potential because it's a shortcut both to the press visibility and then to the attention of the global leaders. So I think that's an easy one to underestimate. And I know our groups across Europe have had mixed experience in the work we've done with exactly this type of technique. But I think engaging the wider citizenship is very, very exciting. Personal opinion and from our organization's own experience with all of those.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that organizational experience that's key to help guide us what we think could work and not work. So engaging citizens is on the table, and I agree that would be useful, but I think it's how do we do that as a group and how do we facilitate that? And maybe that's just basically in working with Kit and Ben and the other groups is basically finding out what's happening in the UK and then amplifying it and doing similar things in each G7 countries and perhaps some of the outreach countries to really bring a global perspective to whatever that visual that the UK groups are looking to exemplify the G7 is.
Actually, rather than waiting for the groups to come up with it, I think the G7 process you've outlined, where the UK group identifies areas of consensus across the pillars, might be a better way to lead it and connect and show how this approach for the G7 agenda will meet the intentions and ambitions of those groups. I think expecting them to come up with it is probably the wrong way round. That again, that's my personal opinion on the advocacy work we've done.
Okay, that's helpful. That's really useful. Thank you for that. Eddie, you have your hand up?
Yeah, maybe just to reflect that we saw a citizens engagement during the G7 in France. And it was led by the government themselves with their approach to reach out to random citizens across France to discuss about climate policy. And they were invited to a summit with the ministries and the presidency of France to discuss G7 issues and domestic issues. And so I think this is the kind of power mapping that we would want to consider like early in 2021 once we have a better understanding on the UK agenda, but particularly on, I don't know if Kit already knows exactly how civil society is organizing around this, the civil society engagement around the G7, but it actually comes back to them. Like the guidance needs to come from UK groups first. And I think this group as international organizations, we're here to stand in solidarity with the UK groups first. And that kind of very grassroots work is something that should be led by civil society groups in the UK, in my perspective.
Okay. Thanks for that. Any other people want to comment on that stuff?
Yeah, I think a lot of action can be taken, and we should take campaign, mobilization, organizing. And I think all these actions should be inclusive so that most marginalized people, disabled people in this country, even other G7 countries can participate and raise their voice. That's my suggestion.
Okay. So, okay, I mean, I think we got some good points, and I think there's some possible actions. I do take Eddie and the points we raised. This power analysis is key, and I want to go back to that when we go to the next session and next steps, and how do we actually action that. I think to take this forward, what we'll do is we'll go through these different possible joint actions. I will list them by the number of ticks, just a very sample way of understanding what we think would be the sort of the key ones. Present them back to the group, and then we can actually pick off 1 or 2, 3 of them that we think could action and make that happen. And we'll do that over the next couple of weeks, so we have that in our agenda. So I'm just looking at the chat to see things coming up there. If people, so anything to add, any other joint actions, stuff to think us through before we go on to the next session? Okay. So we're coming to the end. Hurrah. Congratulations for all those who have stayed on and worked our way through the first plenary, the second plenary, and all the workshops. Well done. I want to hand over to Toko to give us some words. I just want to say thank you to Women Deliver and Uniting Against NTDs for supporting and sponsoring this meeting, and also Joe, Matt, and Ope from Uniting to Combat NTDs for the fantastic work they have done on supporting us and giving technical advice, technical support, because that's been amazing. Before we go to Toko, Wolaine, you have a question?
Sorry, yes, thank you. As colleagues were speaking, I had a question. I mean, when speaking about citizen engagement, I mean, what has changed in the last few years as compared to, I guess, 10 years ago is that now there's not just civil society, there's every single person on Facebook, on Twitter, and right now in particularly crazy ways around the whole conspiracy, everything. And of course, I won't get in the debate of that, but I'm wondering if the G7 government, I don't know if this is possibly a priority, but I know it's been flagged by DG at WHO as infodemia and as a huge challenge for democracies. And I wonder if the G7 countries will not be interested in having actually some civil society players coming with facts, with data, and supporting a stronger case, you know, be it about COVID, like trying to put some data forward and trying to make a case, be it about climate change, to try to balance a little bit the engagement, the very negative engagement they get somehow from citizens. And if there's not an opportunity here to be a slightly, not just bad cop, but like medium cop, and an opportunity there as part of a sort of quid pro quo, if you do things that we want G7, we can also help you on these fronts. So I don't know if it makes sense, but I just thought of that when I heard colleagues speak about citizen engagement.
Can you define infodemia? The first time I've heard of it.
So DG, when you was DG WHO, when you was speaking about the pandemic, COVID pandemic at the beginning, I mean, I guess he started speaking about it around May, June or something like that. He said that the next biggest danger was the infodemia, the infodemic, the fact that basically everybody is self-improvising as an expert to question every basic science. And it's not about justifying politicians' actions, because there have been many mistakes made by many governments, but it's about the fundamentals of science, where every person, every citizen now feels comfortable to say, you know, like the whole debate about hydrochloroquine or whatever the name is. For example, my lasagna seller has an opinion about hydrochloroquine, and it's becoming a bit crazy. So I wonder if the governments may not be interested in a partnership with civil society that works with data to have some sort of involvement.
Well, that's an interesting proposal, and let's put that in the possible joint advocacy accent or tactics to think about how we can create forums that can perhaps deliver more messages around that information and more, say, neutral rather than conspiracy theory type stuff. So possible, let's work on that. Let's put, if you can throw that into the board, that's something we can take a look at. I'm gonna hand over to Toko. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Is there another question or comment?
Yeah, just you know, building on that conspiracy theory thing, I do have a sensitivity to it, and I am noticing that the phrase "Build Back Better" is being used against us in conspiracy theory. So just if you look online and look on what's being said, so being careful not whether, like, if we choose that phrase or not. And I do a lot of work with people in the global south, and I think what to consider is maybe a short video or something that can be passed around on WhatsApp easily, because that's where things get disseminated, like it really quickly. So just considering that, considering it messaging through WhatsApp as well. It's a very fast, lightning fast way to get messages out.
Good point. Do you want to add that to the page, and we can put in some tactics, maybe put a little text thing saying tactics, because I think using WhatsApp, using some of the non-conventional now, but what we haven't used previously because they haven't been prominent, I think it's a good way of thinking about how we communicate.
Okay, I'll put WhatsApp.
Cool. Any other comments? So I actually now have plumbers drilling pipes around me. So randomly noise is going to happen. And I apologize for this, but we had a pipe burst in my building. So I might mute suddenly if that's why. If I do, that's why. But in the meantime, let's hand over to Toko, thanking just to wrap us up, and then I'll come to next steps.
Great. So mine is just an easy task to say thanks to everyone for these very engaging conversations this last couple of weeks. I think it's just been great to see the openness and everyone's ability to just share information and intel. And I think in some spaces, sharing of information is that people just hold on to information, but it's been great, people coming up and just sharing intel, what do we know, and just this desire to work together for the greater good. Although we're working on different themes, we're working on different issues, even under health, we all work on different diseases. But from the very first meeting, everybody is saying, what is it that we need to do in order to deliver wins for everybody everywhere? And I think this recognition, particularly that we are in a changed world for COVID-19, it's changed everybody everywhere. And so the long shopping lists sometimes that may have been the order of the day, and the recognition that actually we might need to work a lot smarter across the different themes. So identifying those areas of convergence, that for me was just really interesting, having those conversations right now. Where do we have commonalities? Where do we combine across themes so that we can really deliver something practical, but that's also going to land? So I think that as a really opening part of the conversation has really been interesting. It's really clear that there's so many connections across the themes. Health has been talking about the link with climate change, education, we've been talking about the link with gender. There are all these connections across the different groups that I think are really interesting. And I think it would be really good beyond this group here to see how are we coming together much more closely so that we're building these connections, but we're coming up with an us that makes sense across the piece. And that I think would be a really, really good thing to do. I think Kel mentioned earlier on that for those that want to be part of the other groups. So if you want to join the gender group or the education group or the climate change group or any other groups that you're not a part of that you want to join, please let Kel know. But I think just this idea as well to have representatives from the different groups so that working through health, we have the gender lens, we're thinking about equity. I think some of the things that would be really good to think about across the groups is to think about what are some of the core principles that we're thinking about, the principles of inclusion. And that I think should cut across, permeates everything that we're doing. It doesn't matter whether we talk about climate or health or education. Inclusion is something that has come up as key, including for people with disabilities. So these things shouldn't be themes that sit on their own, but they're principles that guide everything that we're going to be doing. So I think we can pull those out. So this has been really, really interesting, informative, and very inspiring. 2021 is going to be a very busy year. We've got a lot to do. And I think there are commitments for everybody around the groups to be engaged, to participate, and to deliver a G7 2021 that we're all going to be happy with. So there's going to be follow-up communication about a series of dates for the different groups, but also bringing this group together again, I think in January or sometime, but this is something that's going to be communicated. So thanks very much, everyone. And I will hand over back to you, Cal.
Great. Thank you, Toko, for those words. And quite right, it's a big year. We need really to organize well. I think it's time for civil society to up their game to make sure we influence the big agendas, the Build Back Better. I'll use that language, but take the point that that we have to be careful that language. But the Build Back Better, the COVID response, climate change, these are huge issues that we need to influence, and we really have to up our game and not let government duck them again and again and again. So in terms of next steps, what I will, as chair of the task force, commit to doing is I want to start with maybe working with Kit and some other colleagues on this power analysis to really do some sort of a paper, 1 or 2 pages paper on how decisions made and what are the key interlocutors to influence those decisions in the UK government, and how we can do that from abroad, from the G7 governments, how we can feed into that. I will take the Jamboard and the various information, and I'll take a recording of this and put it up to Sherpa Times so we can capture that and you can have the raw material. But what I will also do is take the joint policy, joint advocacy initiatives and put that in a paper and share that back to you guys. And then we can start a discussion on what we think we should focus on and a couple of key actions. I will continue to populate if people email me or do it directly to that big calendar. Let's make that a really ambitious calendar. It has all the stuff there, as well as the campaign initiatives. Do share some ideas. That's going to help us get our top line messaging, help us get our cross-sector stuff going, and really give momentum around some stuff. So let's share that and keep that open engagements. In terms of a next meeting, there's 2 things. One, I think we had talked about earlier, is bringing this group back together, this big group with all the different coalitions in December towards the holidays, when we know the different coalitions we've heard from today are coming up with their top asks, and then see if we can have that synergy conversation on what the asks are looking like, and that will help us for their 2021 campaigning. For the task force itself, I'm going to propose that we meet on the 11th of December, Thursday, 11th of December. Traditionally, task force meets on a Thursday, and what I would like to do is now for us to have to meet on the first Thursday or the second Thursday every month. Let's set that up. I'm suggesting we meet 45 minutes this first time. We might extend that to an hour as we get more into 2021. We could also make the meetings more frequent if we feel that's a need in 2021. But let's meet on the 11th of December. Ambition there is really to touch base, share some information, get an update, and then feed the stuff that we put together, the power analysis and what have you, into this group, and then share it for a quick 45 minutes. And we can then go back into our working groups for the other meetings, as Toko has said. I will include everybody in the working groups who sent me a note. Please email me, kel@whatworldstrategies.com or info@Sherpa Times. Lots of different ways to get in touch. Send me your note and I'll make sure I add you. And I think that's basically what we're going to do, is really let's focus on the power analysis. What are the key actions we want to deliver in January and get them organized now? And then how do we find the top line messages and working with the other coalitions that are working on this to really synthesize some key messages under which we can populate our own separate issues. thank you, Paul, for pointing out. Paul's my calendar man. That Thursday is actually 10th of December, not the 11th. So apologies. So Thursday, 10th of December, and then we'll come back. So on that note, any final thoughts, comments, any observations, anything that people really want to share?
Very good meeting, and this is first time I'm attending this kind of campaign. I'm pleased and eager to contribute more and work together. Thank you.
Great having you.
Just to say, through the C7 process, really looking forward to working with lots of you, as we already have done, and especially with UKL and the Global Task Force, and just looking forward to being coordinated, including the other engagement groups here in the UK, and just kind of having a really good joint front next year. Great.
Kathy suggested a group photo. Unfortunately, we can't get everybody on the same page, so I don't know if that's going to work, but we can give it a try. To do a joint photo, can everybody turn the videos on if you feel comfortable? If you don't feel comfortable, if you're still in your pajamas, don't worry about it. But if you want to turn your videos, we'll take 2 pictures, 1 per page. And then we'll go from there. So I will take a photo of this. So I am taking a photo at page 1. And just bear with me. I'm going to go to page 2. Take a photo of page 2. Yes, Opie, your hair's right. Good. We have our photos taken. We're all done. So excellent meeting, really fantastic. Wasn't quite sure how it's going to go. It was a bit of a marathon, all the working groups, but I think it was the energy all the way through was amazing. I mean, we've kept the numbers up in terms of participants in each group. Really fantastic. Thank you, Fumi, and our colleagues from Japan for staying up. I think it's 1 o'clock in the morning your time, so really appreciate that. Round of applause. Paul, you joined at 6 a.m., so well done to you for getting up even earlier than the rest of us. Fantastic meeting. Let's keep the momentum going. Keep sharing, keep this idea of openness and transparency, and really looking forward to working with you guys in 2021. And we'll talk again on the 10th of December. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.